Welcome to the night. I am NightSleepWhisper. Tonight, we begin a journey into the heart of Oakhaven. A story of a silver clock, a hidden truth, and a man who became a guardian of time. Settle in, close your eyes, and let the world fade away. As the seconds tick by, let my voice guide you into a deep and peaceful rest. Our journey across time begins now. Arthur lived in a small, quiet town called Oakhaven. It was a place where everyone knew their neighbors, but Arthur preferred to be alone. He was a tall man in his 50s with kind eyes and grey hair. He spent most of his days reading books or working in his garden. On this Tuesday morning, the town was very quiet. A thick, grey fog covered the streets and the trees. Arthur sat near the window with a warm cup of tea in his hands. He liked the peace of the morning. Suddenly, a white truck drove down the narrow road. It stopped in front of Arthur's house. This was unusual because Arthur rarely received visitors or packages. A man in a dark blue uniform stepped out of the truck. He did not look around. He walked to the back of the truck and pulled out a large wooden box. The man carried the box to the porch. He put it down carefully and immediately returned to his truck. He drove away before Arthur could reach the door. Arthur opened his front door. The cold morning air hit his face. He looked down at the box. It was made of heavy, dark wood and had metal edges. There was no return address and no name of a company. There was only a small, white label with his name and address written in black ink. The handwriting was very neat and professional. Who sent this? Arthur asked himself. He did not have many friends, and his family lived far away. He tried to lift the box, but it was very heavy. He had to push it slowly across the floor into his living room. Once the box was inside, Arthur closed the door and locked it. He felt a strange nervousness in his chest. He went to his garage and found a small metal tool to open the box. He began to pull the wooden boards apart. He worked slowly because he did not want to break whatever was inside. Finally, the top of the box came off. He removed many layers of soft white paper. Under the paper, he found a magnificent object. It was a tall, silver clock. The clock was beautiful. The silver was polished and bright. It had many small details, like tiny flowers and leaves carved into the metal. The face of the clock was white with black Roman numerals. The hands were thin and black. Arthur touched the silver. It felt very cold. He looked at the bottom of the clock and saw a small symbol. It was a tiny bird with its wings open. Arthur felt a chill. He remembered that symbol from an old book about the town's history. He placed the clock on his wooden table. The clock was silent. It did not make a sound. The hands stayed at 12 o'clock. Arthur sat in his chair and looked at the silver clock for a long time. The fog outside was now so thick that he could not see the street. He felt that his quiet life was about to change forever. Arthur stood in his living room. He looked at the silver clock for a long time. The clock was very beautiful, but it was also very strange. Why did someone send it to him? He looked inside the wooden box again. He searched through all the white paper, but there was no letter. There was no name. There was only the silver clock and the small symbol of the bird. Arthur wanted to see if the clock worked. He looked for a key to wind it, but he did not see one on the table. He picked up the clock. It was heavier than it looked. He turned the clock over in his hands. The back of the clock was smooth and cold. He looked at the base of the clock very carefully. His fingers touched a small, thin line in the silver. He pushed the silver near the line. Nothing happened. He pushed a little harder. Suddenly, a small part of the base moved. It was a secret drawer. The drawer was very small, only the size of a small box of matches. Arthur pulled the drawer open. Inside, there was a small piece of red cloth. On top of the cloth sat a tiny gold key. The key was bright and yellow. It was different from the silver clock. Arthur took the key out of the drawer. He held it up to the light. On the top of the key, there was the same bird symbol. The bird had its wings open. It was exactly like the symbol on the bottom of the clock. "This is not a key for the clock," Arthur said softly. The key was too small to win the clock. It looked like a key for a jewelry box or a very small door. Arthur felt a sense of excitement. He also felt a little bit of fear. This was not a normal gift. This was a puzzle. He walked to his desk and put the gold key in a small glass bowl. He wanted to keep it safe. Then, he looked at the clock again. The silver hands were still at 12 o'clock. He felt that the clock was waiting for something. Arthur went to his kitchen to make more tea. He needed to think. Who in Oakhaven knew about him? Who knew he liked old things? He thought about the bird symbol. He remembered seeing that bird before. It was on the gate of the big house across the street. But that house was empty. No one lived there for many years. He looked out of his kitchen window. The fog was starting to move away. He could see the dark shape of the empty house. The windows were dark and the garden was full of tall grass. Arthur held his warm cup and watched the house. He wondered if the gold key belonged to that house. He felt a sudden urge to go outside and look at the gate. Arthur stood by his window for a long time. The house across the road was known as the Sterling House. It was a very large building made of grey stone and dark wood. It had many tall windows and a heavy front door. For 10 years, the house was silent and dark. People in Oakhaven did not go near it. They said the house was lonely and full of secrets. The grass in the front yard was very high and dry. The trees were old and their branches reached for the roof like thin, hungry fingers. Arthur remembered Mr. Sterling clearly. He was a wealthy man who loved antique clocks and rare books. One day, 10 years ago, he walked out of his house and never came back. The police searched the town and the forest, but they found nothing. Arthur looked at the second floor of the dark house. The fog moved slowly across the garden, making the shapes of the bushes look like people. Then, he saw something impossible. A small, yellow light appeared in a window on the top floor. It was not a bright electric light. It was soft and moved slowly from side to side. Arthur rubbed his eyes. He thought he was dreaming. "Is someone inside?" He whispered to the empty room. He knew the front gate was locked with heavy iron chains. All the windows were shut tight with boards of wood. He decided to go onto his front porch to see better. He opened his front door very slowly. The cold air made him shiver, but he did not go back inside. He stood behind a large wooden pillar on his porch and watched the house across the street. The light moved again. It went from the left window to the middle window. It looked like a person was carrying a small lamp or a candle. A tall shadow moved across the wall inside the house. Arthur felt his heart beat faster against his chest. He reached into his pocket and touched the small gold key. He felt a strange connection between the silver clock on his table and the light in the empty house. Was someone looking for the key? Or were they looking for the clock? The light stayed in the window for one more minute. Then, it suddenly went out. The house became completely dark again. Everything was very still. The only sound was the wind moving through the tall grass. Arthur waited for a long time, but the light did not return. He went back inside his house and locked the door with 2 turns of the key. He felt a cold shiver on his neck. He felt like someone was watching him from the shadows of the Sterling house. He looked at the silver clock on his table. It was still silent and the hands did not move. Arthur realized that the mystery was not just about a surprise package. It was about a secret that was 10 years old. He did not sleep well that night. Arthur felt tired when he woke up the next morning. He did not sleep well because he was thinking about the yellow light in the empty house. His kitchen was empty, so he needed to go to the store to buy food. He put on his heavy coat and walked outside. The fog was gone, but the air was still very cold. He passed the Sterling house. It looked normal in the daylight, but Arthur remembered the shadow in the window. The local grocery store was called the Green Basket. It was a small shop with fresh vegetables and warm bread. Inside, the store was bright and smelled like sweet apples. A woman was standing near the fruit. She had long, blonde hair and a friendly face. She wore a long blue coat and a colorful scarf. Arthur did not recognize her, but she looked at him and smiled. "Good morning, Arthur," she said. Her voice was calm and kind. Arthur was very surprised. He stopped walking and looked at her. "Good morning. Do I know you?" he asked politely. He was sure he had never met her before. The woman shook her head. "Not really. My name is Clara. I moved to Oakhaven a few weeks ago. I live in the small apartment near the park." Arthur nodded. "It is nice to meet you, Clara. Welcome to our town." Clara picked up a red apple and looked at it. Then she looked back at Arthur. Her eyes were very bright. "It is a quiet town, isn't it? Nothing ever happens here. But sometimes, the mail is interesting. Did you receive anything special yesterday? A package, perhaps?" Arthur felt his heart jump. He did not want to tell this stranger about the silver clock or the gold key. He looked at the floor for a second. "I get a lot of magazines," he said. "The mailman is always very busy on my street." Clara laughed softly. "Magazines are nice. But I saw a delivery truck on your road yesterday morning. A large wooden box is much more interesting than a magazine." Arthur felt nervous. How did she know about the truck? He lived on a very quiet road with no other houses nearby except for the empty Sterling house. "It was just some old tools for my garden." He lied. He did not like lying, but he felt he had to protect his secret. He did not know if he could trust this woman. Clara watched him for a moment. Her eyes were sharp and intelligent. "I see. Garden tools are very useful. Well, have a nice day, Arthur. Maybe I will see you again soon." She put the apple in her basket and walked toward the front of the store. Arthur watched her go. He realized he forgot to buy his milk. He kept thinking about her question. Why was Clara interested in his mail? She was a stranger, but she knew his name and his house. He felt that Clara knew something about the silver clock. Arthur paid for his bread and walked home quickly. He wanted to make sure his front door was still locked. Arthur returned home and put his bread on the kitchen table. He did not feel hungry. He looked at the silver clock. It sat on his table like a silent guest. The bird symbol on the base seemed to watch him. He thought about Clara and her questions at the grocery store. She knew too much about his package. He needed answers, and there was only one place in town to find them. The Oakhaven Library was a very old building. It was made of red bricks and had large, heavy doors. Inside, it was very quiet and smelled like old paper and wood. Arthur walked past the long rows of books. He saw the librarian, a woman named Mrs. Gable. She was an older woman with silver glasses and a kind smile. She was busy putting books on a high shelf. "Good afternoon, Arthur," Mrs. Gable said quietly. "You look very serious today. Can I help you find something?" Arthur nodded. "Yes, Mrs. Gable. I am looking for the history of Oakhaven. I want to see old photos and records from the town, especially about the Sterling family." Mrs. Gable pointed to a small room at the back of the library. "The history room is over there. We have many boxes of old newspapers and photos. Just be careful with them, please." Arthur went into the small room. He turned on a lamp on the desk. The light was soft and yellow. He found a large, black book with the words Oakhaven History, 1900 to 1960 on the front. He sat down and began to turn the pages slowly. He saw photos of the old town square, the first train station, and the building of the school. He reached the section for the year 1950. There was a large photo of a party at the Sterling house. In the photo, a group of men in suits and women in long dresses stood in the grand living room. In the center of the group was a young man. Arthur recognized him. It was a young Mr. Sterling. He looked happy and proud. Arthur looked closely at the background of the photo. On a dark wooden shelf behind Mr. Sterling, he saw something familiar. It was the silver clock. It looked exactly the same, with the same tiny silver flowers and leaves. Under the photo, there was a small caption. It said, "The Sterling family celebrates the arrival of the silver bird. A gift from the City of London. 1950. Arthur felt a cold shiver. The clock was 76 years old. It was not just an antique. It was a famous piece of history for the Sterling family. Why was it in his house now? He continued to read. The book said the clock was part of a set. There was the clock and a matching silver box. The book said the clock was a symbol of the keepers of time. Arthur did not know what that meant. He closed the book and felt a heavy weight in his heart. He was no longer just a man with a mysterious package. He was holding a piece of a secret that started many years ago. As he walked out of the library, he looked behind him. The street was empty, but he felt a pair of eyes on his back. He walked faster. Arthur did not leave the library immediately. He felt that there was more to learn. He went back to the history room and looked for a box of old newspapers from 10 years ago. He wanted to find the exact date when Mr. Sterling disappeared. After a few minutes of searching, he found a yellowed newspaper. The date was October 14th. The headline on the front page was large and bold. Local businessman vanishes without a trace. Arthur sat down and read the article. It said that Mr. Thomas Sterling was a very successful businessman. He owned many buildings in Oakhaven and the nearby city. He was also a collector of rare clocks. The article explained that Mr. Sterling was last seen in his office on a Tuesday evening. He told his assistant he was going home to work on a private project. The next morning, his assistant went to the Sterling house, but the door was locked and Mr. Sterling was gone. The police found no signs of a struggle. The article said, his car was still in the garage. His coat was still on the chair. It was like he simply stopped existing. Arthur turned the page. There was a list of items that were missing from the house. His heart stopped when he saw the first item on the list. One silver clock with a bird symbol, known as the silver bird. So, the clock was stolen on the night Mr. Sterling disappeared. Or maybe Mr. Sterling took it with him. Arthur leaned back in his chair. He felt a cold sweat on his forehead. If the clock was missing for 10 years, why did it arrive at his house yesterday? And who kept it for all that time? He thought about the keepers of time mentioned from the other book. Was Mr. Sterling part of a secret group? Arthur looked at the photo of Mr. Sterling again. The man had a serious face, but he looked honest. Arthur felt sorry for him. Mr. Sterling had a big house and a lot of money, but in the end, he was alone and in danger. Mrs. Gable walked into the room. "Are you finding what you need, Arthur?" she asked. "Yes, thank you," Arthur replied. He closed the newspaper quickly. He did not want to explain why he was interested in a 10-year-old mystery. Mr. Sterling was a strange man. Mrs. Gable said softly. She looked at the newspaper on the desk. "He was very kind to the library. He gave us a lot of money for new books. But he always seemed like he was waiting for something to happen. People say he was afraid of his business partners." "Who were his partners?" Arthur asked. "Important people." Mrs. Gable said. The mayor was one of them. But that was a long time ago. Now, please be careful. Arthur. Some secrets in this town are better left alone. Arthur thanked her and walked out into the cold afternoon air. He felt the weight of the mystery growing. He was no longer just a neighbor. He was now involved in the life and death of Thomas Sterling. He walked home quickly, keeping his head down. He did not see the black car parked across the street from the library. The driver watched him until he turned the corner. Arthur walked home quickly. He kept his hands deep in his pockets. The air was getting colder as the sun began to set. He thought about the silver clock and the story of Mr. Sterling. He thought about the mayor and the strange keepers of time. He felt like his quiet town was full of ghosts and secrets. He reached his small house and stopped at the front gate. He looked at his front door. Arthur was a very careful man. He always locked his door when he left his house. But now, the door was open by a few inches. A small gap of darkness showed between the door and the frame. Arthur's heart began to beat very fast. He looked around the street. It was empty and silent. The shadows of the trees were long and thin on the ground. He walked slowly to the porch. He pushed the door open. It moved quietly on its hinges. "Hello," he said. His voice was small and shaky. No one answered. The house was very still. He walked into the living room. The first thing he did was look at the wooden table. The silver clock was still there. It shone in the fading light from the window. Arthur felt a little better. At least the visitor did not steal the beautiful clock. But then he looked closer at the table. In front of the clock, there was a small piece of white paper. It was not there when he left for the library. He picked up the paper with a trembling hand. There were only 2 words written on it in large, black letters. "Stop looking." Arthur dropped the paper onto the table. He felt a wave of fear. Someone was inside his home while he was away. Someone knew he went to the library to ask questions. Someone was watching his every move. He ran to his kitchen and checked the back door. It was still locked from the inside. He went to his bedroom. His bed was neat, but his closet door was open. He always kept that door closed. He went back to the living room and sat down in his favorite chair. He held his head in his hands. He wanted his quiet, boring life back. He wanted to forget about the clock and the mystery of Mr. Sterling. But he knew it was too late. The person who left the note was near. He looked at the gold key in the glass bowl on his desk. It was still there. He took the key and put it inside his pocket. He felt like the key was important, perhaps even dangerous. He did not turn on the lights in the house. He sat in the dark and watched the front door. He felt like a prisoner in his own home. He thought of Clara. Was she a friend, or was she the person who entered his house? He did not know who to trust anymore. Arthur did not sleep at all that night. He sat in his chair and watched the front door until the sun came up. The note on the table, with its dark letters, felt like a heavy weight. He knew he was in danger, but he also felt a spark of anger. This was his home, and someone had entered it without permission. He thought about Clara. She was the only person who had asked him about the package. Was she the one who left the note? At 9 o'clock in the morning, Arthur decided to find her. He remembered she said she lived in a small apartment near the park. He put on his coat and walked out into the cold morning. The town was beginning to wake up. People were walking to work, and the smell of fresh coffee came from the local bakery. Arthur did not stop for coffee. He walked straight to the park. The park was a large area with many tall trees and a small lake. On the north side of the park, there was a row of old apartment buildings. Arthur found a bench behind a large oak tree and waited. He watched the entrance of the middle building. After 30 minutes, the front door opened. Clara walked out. She was wearing the same blue coat and colorful scarf. She looked around quickly, then started walking toward the center of the park. Arthur stood up and followed her. He stayed far behind and hid behind trees and bushes. He felt like a character in one of his mystery books. His heart was beating fast, but he did not stop. Clara walked to a quiet area of the park where the trees were very thick. A man was waiting for her there. He was tall and wore a very expensive dark suit. He had black hair and looked very serious. Arthur hid behind a large stone wall and watched them. He could not hear their words, but he could see their faces. Clara looked upset. She was talking fast and moving her hands. The man in the dark suit did not move. He stood very still with his hands behind his back. Then, the man reached into his pocket and pulled out a small piece of paper. He showed it to Clara. Clara took the paper and read it. Her face went pale, and she shook her head. The man stepped closer to her. He spoke in a low voice, and his expression was cold. He looked like he was giving her an order. Clara looked down at the ground. She looked sad and afraid. After a moment, the man turned and walked away toward a black car parked on the street. Arthur stayed behind the wall. He realized that Clara was not just a curious neighbor. She was involved with dangerous people. Was she trying to help him, or was she working for the man in the suit? He watched Clara as she sat on a wooden bench and put her face in her hands. She looked very alone. Arthur wanted to talk to her, but he was afraid. He decided to go back home and look at the silver clock again. He felt that the answer was hidden inside the silver flowers and the silent hands of the clock. Arthur arrived at his house and locked the door behind him. He was breathing fast. He could not forget the look of fear on Clara's face in the park. He also could not forget the cold expression of the man in the dark suit. Arthur felt like he was in the middle of a storm, and he did not have an umbrella. He looked at the silver clock on his table. It was the center of everything. There must be something more. Arthur whispered. He picked up the clock and moved it to his desk, where the light was better. He took a small magnifying glass and looked at the back of the clock. He had already found the small drawer with the gold key, but he felt there was another secret. He looked at the silver flowers carved into the metal. One flower near the top was slightly different. It was a rose, and its center was a tiny silver button. Arthur used his thumb to press the silver rose. At first, nothing happened. He pressed harder. He heard a soft metal sound from inside the clock. A thin panel on the back of the clock popped open. Behind the panel, there was no clock machinery. Instead, there was a small, hollow space. Inside the space sat a small notebook. It had a dark blue leather cover. The leather was old and worn at the edges. Arthur pulled it out with trembling fingers. He opened the first page. The handwriting was neat and sharp. It was the same handwriting from the label on the wooden box. The notebook was full of dates and addresses. Arthur turned the pages slowly. Some of the addresses were in Oakhaven, but many were in the big city 2 hours away. Beside each address, there was a time and a name. He saw names of banks, lawyers, and even the town hall. Arthur looked at the dates. They started 20 years ago and continued until 10 years ago. He turned to the very last page. There was only one entry on that page. It was dated October 14th. The same day Mr. Sterling disappeared. Beside the date, there was an address. 1200, Oak Lane. Arthur knew that address. It was the address of the empty Sterling house across the street. Under the address, there was a final note. The bird must fly before the clock stops. The vault is ready. Arthur felt a chill run down his spine. The notebook was a record of Mr. Sterling's private business. It was not about money or normal trade. It looked like a diary of a man who was hiding something very important. Arthur realized the silver clock was not just a decoration. It was a safe. It was built to carry this blue notebook and the gold key. He sat back in his chair and looked at the notebook. He felt like he was holding a bomb. If the man in the dark suit wanted this notebook, he would do anything to get it. Arthur looked at his front door. He felt very unsafe. He decided to hide the notebook under his mattress. He needed to find out what happened at 1200 Oak Lane on that final night. The afternoon sun disappeared behind heavy, grey clouds. By 6 o'clock in the evening, the sky was almost black. Arthur sat in his kitchen and watched the first drops of rain hit the window. Soon, the rain became very heavy. It was a summer storm, and the wind was strong. The branches of the old trees in his yard moved wildly. The wind made a low, whistling sound as it pushed against the corners of the house. Arthur felt very lonely. He had the silver clock on the table and the blue notebook hidden under his mattress. He felt like the walls of his house were too thin. The rain was so loud that he could not hear anything else. He turned on the small lamp over the stove, but the light was weak. The storm was getting worse. A sudden flash of light filled the sky, followed by a long, heavy roll of thunder that shook the floor. He tried to read a book to calm his mind, but he could not focus. He kept looking at the front door. He checked the lock for the third time. Then, he heard something. It was not the sound of the rain or the wind. It was a heavy, slow sound on the wooden boards of his front porch. It sounded like someone was walking very carefully. Arthur froze. He put his book down on the table. He did not move. He did not even want to breathe. He listened with all his energy. The sound happened again. A slow, heavy step. Then another. The person was moving toward the front door. Arthur stood up quietly. He did not turn on any more lights. He walked into the dark living room and stood near the window. He moved the curtain a tiny bit with one finger. Outside, the rain was like a thick curtain of water. Everything was grey and blurry. But he could see a dark shape standing on his porch. The shape was tall. The person wore a long, dark coat with a hood. The hood covered their face. The person stood perfectly still in front of the door. They did not knock. They did not try to open the door. They just stood there, watching the house. Another flash of light brightened the porch for a second. In that second, Arthur saw the person's hands. They were wearing black leather gloves. The person reached out and touched the wood of the door. Then, the person turned their head toward the window. Arthur jumped back and let the curtain fall. He was sure the person saw him. His heart was racing. He looked for something to use as a weapon. He grabbed a heavy metal flashlight from a shelf. He waited for the sound of the door breaking, but it did not come. After a few minutes, he looked out the window again. The porch was empty. The dark figure was gone. Arthur stayed by the window for the rest of the night. The rain did not stop, and the wind continued to shake the house. He realized he was no longer safe in his home. The mystery of the silver clock was now a hunt, and he was the one being hunted. Arthur stayed on the floor behind his sofa for a long time. The rain was still hitting the roof, but it was not as loud as before. The heavy wind was also starting to calm down. He held the metal flashlight tightly in his hand. His fingers were cold. He listened for any sound from the porch, but there was only the rhythm of the water falling from the trees. Finally, Arthur stood up. He felt a little brave because the house was silent. He walked to the window and moved the curtain again. The porch was empty. He looked at the street. The street lights were flickering. A thick, white fog was moving back into the town. It looked like smoke. He saw a dark shape moving near the edge of his yard. It was the person from the porch. The man was running toward the fog. He moved very quickly and quietly. Arthur watched the man disappear into the grey mist. He did not know where the man went. The man was like a shadow that was part of the night. I need to see if he left anything, Arthur said to himself. He unlocked his front door slowly. He stepped out onto the wet porch. The air was very cold and smelled like wet earth. He turned on his flashlight. The bright beam of light moved across the wooden floor. He saw wet footprints on the boards. They were large footprints from heavy boots. Arthur followed the footprints with his light. Near the stairs, he saw something dark on the floor. He walked closer and bent down. It was a black leather glove. He picked it up. The leather was expensive and soft, but it was soaked with rain. He turned the glove over in his hand. Inside the wrist of the glove, there were 3 small letters stitched in white thread. T. S. M. Arthur's heart stopped. He thought about the name from the library. Thomas Sterling. But Mr. Sterling disappeared 10 years ago. Could this glove belong to him? Or did it belong to someone else with the same initials? He thought about the man in the dark suit he saw in the park with Clara. That man looked wealthy and wore expensive clothes. He looked back at the empty house across the street. The Sterling house was still dark. The light he saw before was gone. He felt a sudden connection between the man on his porch, the black glove, and the secret vault mentioned in the blue notebook. He went back inside and locked the door. He put the wet glove on the kitchen table next to the silver clock. The 3 letters, T. S. M, seemed to shine under the kitchen light. He felt that the mystery was becoming very personal. Someone was not just watching him. They were trying to tell him something. Or they were trying to take back what was theirs. He looked at the gold key in his pocket. He knew he could not wait any longer. He had to go to the empty house. The sun was not visible the next morning. The sky was a flat, heavy grey, and the fog was thicker than ever. It felt as if the world ended at the edge of Arthur's garden. Arthur stood in his hallway and looked at himself in the mirror. He looked tired. There were dark circles under his eyes, but his gaze was firm. He was a man who lived a quiet life, but he was not a coward. He put the gold key in his right pocket and the blue notebook in his left pocket. He decided to leave the silver clock at home, hidden under a pile of old blankets in the closet. He walked out of his front door. The air was damp and clung to his skin. He crossed the narrow street toward the Sterling house. Up close, the house looked even larger and more frightening. The grey stones were covered in dark green moss. The front gate was locked with a heavy iron chain, but Arthur knew a secret. He had lived across from this house for many years. He knew that the wooden fence at the side of the property was broken. He walked along the fence until he found the loose board. He pushed it aside and stepped into the garden of the Sterling house. The tall grass was wet and soaked his trousers immediately. He moved through the bushes, trying to stay quiet. He reached the side door of the house. This door was smaller than the front door. It was made of dark oak and had a small iron handle. Arthur took a deep breath. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the gold key. His hand was shaking slightly. He looked at the key. The gold was bright against the grey air. He thought about the man in the dark suit and the warning note. If he entered this house, he could not go back to his old life. He put the key into the lock. It fit perfectly. Arthur turned the key. He heard a soft metal sound from inside the door. The lock was old, but it worked smoothly. He pushed the door. It was very heavy and moved slowly. A smell of old dust and dry wood came from inside the house. It was a smell of a place that was frozen in time. Arthur stepped into the darkness of the house and closed the door behind him. The silence inside was absolute. It was a different kind of silence than his own home. This was the silence of a tomb. Arthur stood still for a minute to let his eyes adjust to the low light. He could see a long hallway with a high ceiling. There were empty picture frames on the walls and a thick layer of dust on the floor. "I am inside," Arthur whispered. His voice sounded strange in the large space. He felt a mix of fear and curiosity. He was now standing in the heart of the mystery. He began to walk slowly down the hallway, his boots making a soft sound on the dusty wood. He was looking for the desk he saw in the old library photo. Arthur walked deeper into the house. The air was very cold, and he could see his breath in the dim light. The dust on the floor was thick. It looked like grey snow. He saw no other footprints, which made him feel a little better. He was alone for now. He moved from the hallway into a large room on the right. This room was a library. Thousands of books stood on tall shelves that reached the ceiling. Most of the furniture was covered with large white sheets. In the shadows, the covered chairs looked like ghosts. Arthur felt a shiver. He moved his flashlight across the room. The light landed on a large object in the corner that was not covered. It was a massive wooden desk. Arthur walked toward it. The desk was beautiful and very old. It was made of a dark, rich wood that seemed to glow under the light of his flashlight. He touched the surface of the wood. It was smooth and cool. He realized immediately that this was the same wood used for the box that brought the silver clock to his door. "This is the place," Arthur whispered. The desk had many small drawers and beautiful carvings. On the front of the desk, right in the center, was the symbol of the bird with its wings open. It was exactly like the symbol on the gold key and the silver clock. Arthur felt a sense of wonder. He was standing where Mr. Sterling once sat. He imagined the businessman writing letters and looking at his clocks. He tried to open the top drawer of the desk, but it was locked. He looked at the other drawers. They were all locked. Arthur remembered the gold key in his pocket. He pulled it out, but the key was too small for these large locks. He realized the gold key was for something else, something smaller hidden inside the house or the desk itself. He began to search the sides of the desk. He remembered how he found the secret compartment in the silver clock. He pushed on the carved flowers and the wooden birds. He looked for a hidden button or a sliding panel. The wood felt solid, but he did not give up. He knew that Mr. Sterling loved puzzles. Suddenly, Arthur noticed a small hole near the bottom of the desk. It was hidden behind a wooden leg. He knelt on the dusty floor. The hole was round and very small. He took the gold key and pushed it into the hole. It was a perfect fit. He turned the key to the right. A soft metal click came from the top of the desk. A secret drawer popped open near the writing surface. It was a very thin drawer, hidden inside the frame of the desk. Arthur stood up and pulled the drawer open. His heart was beating fast. Inside the drawer, there was a single piece of paper and a small, silver compass. The paper was old and yellow. Arthur picked it up carefully. He knew he was close to the truth. Arthur held the yellow paper in his hands. It felt very thin, like it might break if he moved too quickly. The silver compass lay in the drawer, its needle pointing toward the back of the house. Arthur looked at the handwriting on the paper. It was the same neat, sharp writing from the notebook and the shipping label. This was a letter from Thomas Sterling himself. The letter was not long. It started with a strange title. To the Keeper of the Time. Arthur read the words slowly. "If you are reading this, I am gone. The town is changing, and the air is full of greed. I have spent my life protecting the wealth of the people, but the others want it for themselves. They wear expensive suits and speak with silver tongues, but their hearts are cold. I cannot let them find the vault." Arthur felt a lump in his throat. He looked around the dark library. He felt like Mr. Sterling was there with him, a ghost in the shadows. He continued reading. "The silver bird is the lock, and the gold key is the way. The blue notebook contains the map of our history. But the most important thing is the vault. It is not hidden in the ground or behind a wall. It is hidden in plain sight. Use the compass. It does not point north. It points to the truth." The letter ended with a final warning. "Do not trust the mayor. He was my friend, but now he is a wolf. Stay in the light, and keep the clock winding." Time is the only thing we cannot buy back. Arthur sat on the dusty floor. His mind was spinning. The keeper of the time was a real group. Mr. Sterling was their leader. And now, because Arthur had the clock, the key, and the notebook, he was the new keeper. He looked at the silver compass in the drawer. He picked it up. The needle did not move when he turned the compass. It stayed fixed in one direction. It pointed toward the center of the house, where a large fireplace stood. "The vault is here," Arthur whispered. "In this house." He felt a mix of pride and terror. He was just a man who liked gardening and quiet mornings. Now, he was responsible for a secret vault and the legacy of a missing man. He thought about the mayor. Mrs. Gable at the library said the mayor was Mr. Sterling's partner. The letter said he was a wolf. Suddenly, Arthur heard a new sound. It was not the wind or the house settling. It was the sound of a car engine outside. The car was idling near the front gate. Arthur quickly put the letter and the compass into his pocket. He turned off his flashlight. The room became pitch black. He crawled toward the window and looked through a small hole in the wooden boards. A black car sat at the gate. A man stepped out. It was the man in the dark suit from the park. He was looking at the house. He had a large ring of keys in his hand. Arthur felt a wave of cold fear. The man in the dark suit was opening the front gate. Arthur knew he had to leave the Sterling house immediately. He could not be found inside. If the man caught him, Arthur did not know what would happen. He moved quietly through the dark library. He did not use his flashlight. He used his hands to feel the walls and the furniture. He reached the small side door. He opened it slowly. It made a very soft sound like a sigh. Arthur stepped out into the fog. The grey mist was thick and wet. It hid him from the man at the front gate. Arthur ran across the high grass. He did not look back. He pushed through the broken fence and crossed the street to his own house. Inside his home, Arthur locked the door and leaned against it. He was breathing very hard. He took the letter and the silver compass from his pocket. He hid them inside a large flower jar in the kitchen. Then he sat at his table and tried to look normal. He picked up a newspaper and waited. 10 minutes later, there was a loud knock at the front door. The sound was heavy and firm. Arthur's heart jumped, but he walked to the door. He looked through the small glass window. It was not the man in the dark suit. It was Sheriff Miller. The sheriff was a large man with a wide face and a brown uniform. He looked tired and serious. Arthur opened the door. "Good morning, Sheriff. Is something wrong?" Sheriff Miller looked at Arthur for a long time. He adjusted his heavy belt. "Good morning, Arthur. I was driving by. I thought I saw someone walking near the Sterling house. Then I saw you coming from that direction. You look a bit wet." Arthur looked down at his trousers. They were soaked from the tall grass. He tried to stay calm. "I was just checking my fence, Sheriff. The storm last night was very strong. I wanted to see if the wind moved any of the old boards near the road." The sheriff narrowed his eyes. "The Sterling house is a dangerous place, Arthur. It is old and the floors are weak. The mayor is worried about people going inside. He wants to sell the property soon." "I understand," Arthur said. "I have no reason to go inside an empty house." "I hope so," the sheriff replied. "There are many secrets in this town, Arthur. Some people get hurt when they ask too many questions. You are a good man. Stay in your garden and stay away from the Sterling place." The sheriff did not smile. He looked at the living room behind Arthur. He seemed to be looking for something. After a moment, he turned around. "Have a good day, Arthur. And dry your clothes. You don't want to get sick." Arthur watched the sheriff walk to his police car. He felt a new kind of fear. The sheriff was not just giving him a friendly warning. He was watching him. Arthur realized that even the police were part of the mayor's world. He went to the kitchen and looked at the flour jar. He was alone, and he did not know who was a friend and who was an enemy. Arthur could not stay in his house. The walls felt too close, and the memory of the sheriff's cold eyes made him restless. He needed to know the truth about the woman from the grocery store. He took his coat and walked toward the center of town. He went to a small cafe called the Blue Kettle. It was a warm place with the smell of roasted coffee and sweet cinnamon. He saw Clara sitting at a small table in the corner. She was looking out the window at the gray sky. She had a cup of coffee in front of her, but she was not drinking it. Arthur walked over and sat down in the chair across from her. Clara looked startled, but then she sighed. "I thought you might come looking for me," she said softly. Arthur did not wait. "I saw you in the park yesterday, Clara. I saw you with the man in the dark suit. He did not look like a friend. And the sheriff just visited my house. He was asking questions about the Sterling house." Clara looked around the cafe to make sure no one was listening. The only other person was an old man reading a newspaper near the door. She leaned forward. "Arthur, I am sorry. I didn't want to put you in danger. But you have something that belongs to my family." Arthur narrowed his eyes. "Your family?" "My full name is Clara Sterling," she whispered. "Thomas Sterling was my grandfather. When he disappeared 10 years ago, the police said it was an accident. They said he probably fell into the river. But my mother and I never believed them. He was a careful man. He was a keeper." Arthur felt the blood move quickly in his veins. "The keepers of time," he said. Clara nodded. "It is an old group of people in this town. They protected the town's history and its wealth. My grandfather was the leader. The silver clock you received is the key to everything. It contains the codes to the town's secret funds. The mayor and his men want that money. They have been looking for that clock for 10 years. Why was it sent to me?" Arthur asked. "My grandfather had a list of names," Clara explained. "People he trusted. Your name was on that list, Arthur. You didn't know him well, but he watched you. He knew you were an honest man who liked history. He must have arranged for the clock to be sent to you if something happened to the person who was holding it." "And the man in the suit?" "That is Mr. Vance," Clara said, her voice shaking slightly. "He works for the mayor. He knows I am here, and he is following me. He thinks I have the clock. He is threatening me, Arthur. He says if I don't find the silver bird, something bad will happen." Arthur looked at Clara's worried face. He realized she was not his enemy. She was a victim, just like her grandfather. "I have the clock," Arthur said quietly. "And I found a letter. Your grandfather is not in the river, Clara. I think he is still alive." Clara's eyes filled with tears. "You really think so?" "I do," Arthur said. "But we have to be very careful. The mayor and the sheriff are working together. We cannot trust anyone else." Arthur and Clara walked back to Arthur's house together. They stayed away from the main road. They walked through the narrow alleys behind the shops. Arthur was very careful. He looked behind them every few minutes. He did not see the black car or the sheriff. The air was still cold, but the fog was finally lifting. When they were safely inside the house, Arthur locked the door. He went to his bedroom and pulled the blue notebook from under his mattress. He brought it to the kitchen table. Clara sat down and touched the leather cover with her fingers. She looked sad but also hopeful. "This belonged to him," she whispered. "I remember seeing him write in a book like this when I was very young." Arthur opened the notebook. He turned past the lists of names and addresses. He stopped at a page in the middle of the book. On this page, there were several strange drawings. At first, Arthur thought they were just sketches of flowers or trees. But as he looked closer, he saw that the lines were too straight. "Look at this, Clara," Arthur said. He pointed to a small circle in the middle of a drawing. This circle has the name Town Square written inside it. And these lines go out from the center. Clara leaned in. She studied the drawings for a long time. These are not flowers. They are streets. But they are not the streets we see every day. Look at the names. Coal Path, Deep Way, and Water Tunnel. These are underground. Arthur felt a spark of excitement. The town's old tunnels. I heard stories about them. 100 years ago, people used tunnels to move coal and water under the town. But most people think the tunnels are closed or collapsed. Clara turned the page. The drawings became more detailed. They are not closed. My grandfather mapped them. Look at this line here. It starts at the old clock shop in the center of town. It goes all the way under the park and ends exactly under the Sterling House. Arthur looked at the silver compass in his hand. It was still pointing in a specific direction. He compared the compass with the map in the notebook. Everything started to make sense. The keeper of the time used these tunnels to move through the town in secret. It was how Mr. Sterling moved without being seen by the mayor or his men. The letter said the vault is hidden in plain sight. Arthur said, "Maybe the entrance to the vault is in the tunnels. If the mayor is watching the house, we cannot go through the front door. We have to go under it." Clara looked worried. "The tunnels are dark and dangerous. Arthur, they have been empty for many years. We don't know what is down there." "We have the map," Arthur replied. He felt more determined than ever. "And we have the key. Your grandfather left these things for a reason. He wanted someone to find the truth." Clara nodded slowly. She took a deep breath. "You are right. We must follow the map. But where do we start? We need to find an entrance that the mayor does not know about." Arthur looked at the map again. He pointed to a small mark near the town library. "The old clock shop. It is right next to the library. That is where the first tunnel begins." Arthur and Clara decided to meet later that evening. Arthur wanted to check the entrance to the tunnels near the library, but he did not want Clara to be in danger. He told her to go back to her apartment and wait for his call. After she left, Arthur put on his hat and walked toward the town square. The afternoon was very quiet. Most people were inside their homes because the weather was still damp and cold. Arthur walked slowly. He tried to look like a man going for a simple walk. However, as he turned the corner near the bakery, he saw something that made him stop. The black car was parked at the end of the street. The door of the car opened, and the man in the dark suit stepped out. It was Mr. Vance. He did not look at Arthur directly, but he began to walk in the same direction. Arthur felt a cold knot in his stomach. He was being followed. He did not want to lead Mr. Vance to the old clock shop or back to his house. Arthur turned left and walked faster. Mr. Vance walked faster, too. Arthur could hear the rhythm of the man's leather shoes on the stone sidewalk. The sound was steady and scary. Arthur looked for a place to hide. The red brick building of the library was only a few meters away. He ran to the heavy wooden doors and pushed them open. Inside, the library was warm and silent. Mrs. Gable was at her desk. She looked up and saw Arthur's worried face. "Arthur, are you okay? You look like you saw a ghost." She whispered. "I am fine, Mrs. Gable," Arthur said, trying to catch his breath. "I just need to find a book in the back room. Please, do not tell anyone I am here." Mrs. Gable looked confused, but she saw the fear in his eyes and nodded. Arthur moved quickly to the history room at the back of the building. He went to the corner where the tall shelves of old newspapers were kept. He sat on the floor behind a large wooden table. He was completely hidden by the shadows. A moment later, the front door of the library opened. Arthur heard a heavy step on the carpet. He stayed very still. He did not move a muscle. Through the gap between two bookshelves, he saw Mr. Vance. The man stood in the center of the library. He looked around the room with sharp, angry eyes. He looked at the rows of books and the small reading tables. Mr. Vance walked toward Mrs. Gable. "Has a man named Arthur come in here?" he asked. His voice was deep and very cold. Mrs. Gable did not look up from her papers. "Many people come here, sir. I do not always watch the door. If you want to find someone, you can check the park." Mr. Vance did not say thank you. He stood there for a long minute. Arthur could hear his own heart beating loudly in the silence. He was afraid Mr. Vance would hear it too. Finally, the man turned around and walked out of the library. Arthur waited for 10 minutes. He did not move until he was sure the man was gone. He felt a sense of relief, but he knew the hunt was getting more intense. Mr. Vance was no longer waiting. He was searching. Arthur realized he could not stay in the library forever. He needed to find the entrance to the tunnels before the sun went down. Arthur waited in the library for another 10 minutes to be sure Mr. Vance was gone. He then walked back to his house using the narrowest paths he could find. He was very careful. He stopped and looked behind every corner. When he reached his home, he quickly went to the closet. He pulled the silver clock out from under the old blankets. He put it into a thick, dark bag. He needed to talk to an expert, and there was only one man in Oakhaven who knew everything about old metal and gears. Mr. Henderson's jewelry shop was located on a small, quiet street near the center of town. The windows were filled with gold watches, silver rings, and old pocket clocks. Arthur walked to the door and pushed it open. A small bell above the door moved to announce his arrival. The shop was warm and smelled like machine oil and polished metal. An old man with a bald head and very large glasses sat behind a glass counter. This was Mr. Henderson. "Good evening, Arthur," the old man said. He was cleaning a small gear with a tiny brush. "I am closing the shop soon. Do you need a new battery for your watch?" Arthur shook his head. He placed the heavy bag on the counter. "No, Mr. Henderson. I need you to look at something special. It is a mystery, and I think you are the only one who can help me." Arthur reached into the bag and pulled out the silver clock. The silver shone brightly under the bright shop lights. The tiny silver flowers and the bird symbol looked almost real. Mr. Henderson looked at the clock. He did not move. He did not speak. His face slowly turned very white, like a sheet of paper. He looked like he was seeing something from a nightmare. "Where did you get this?" Henderson whispered. His voice was thin and weak. "It was delivered to my house in a wooden box," Arthur said quietly. "I found a gold key inside a secret drawer at the base." Henderson stepped back from the counter. He looked at the front door to make sure it was closed and locked. Then he looked at the windows. He was very afraid. "Put it back in the bag, Arthur. Put it away right now." Arthur was confused and worried. "What is wrong?" "It is a beautiful clock, but it is just an object." "It is not just an object," Henderson said. His hands were shaking so much that he had to grip the edge of the counter. "That is the silver bird of the Sterling family. It has been missing for 10 years. People disappeared because of this clock. Arthur, it is a very dangerous thing to have." "I know about the keepers of time," Arthur said, trying to show he understood. Henderson's eyes went wide behind his glasses. "Then you know too much already. The mayor has been looking for this for a decade. He has eyes everywhere in this town. If his men find you with this clock, they will not just take it from you. They will make sure you never speak to anyone again." Arthur felt a cold chill in his bones. "The sheriff told me to stay away from the Sterling house. Is he part of this too?" Henderson nodded slowly. "The sheriff, the mayor, and that man Vance. They are all looking for the secret vault. They believe the clock is the only way to open it. You must leave. Arthur, take the clock and hide it better. Do not go to the police. Do not trust anyone in a uniform." Arthur put the clock back into the dark bag. He felt the heavy weight of the silver. "I want to help Clara Sterling," he said. "She is back in town." Henderson looked sad. "Clara is a good woman, but she is in the middle of a fire now. Tell her to be very careful. And Arthur, watch the time. The silver bird is more than a key. It is a warning that time is running out for all of us." Arthur walked out of the shop. The night was dark and the air was freezing. He held the bag tightly against his chest. He knew that Mr. Henderson was right. He was no longer a quiet man with a hobby. He was a man with a secret that could destroy the town leaders. Arthur walked away from the jewelry shop. The bag felt heavier than before. Mr. Henderson's words stayed in his mind like a dark cloud. He was now certain that the mayor and the sheriff were not protectors of the town. They were hunters, and they wanted the silver bird. Arthur walked quickly through the shadows. He did not go near the streetlights. He felt like every window in the town had eyes. He arrived at his house and locked every door and window. He went to the kitchen and drank a glass of water. His hands were still a little shaky. He looked at the silver clock. It was so beautiful, but it brought so much trouble. He wondered if Mr. Sterling felt the same way 10 years ago. Suddenly, he heard a soft sound near the front door. It was the sound of paper sliding against wood. Arthur froze. He waited for a minute, then walked to the hallway. A small, white envelope lay on the floor. Someone had pushed it under the door and disappeared. Arthur picked up the envelope. There was no name on the outside. He opened it and pulled out a small piece of paper. The handwriting was messy, as if the person was in a great hurry. It was from Clara. "Arthur, I have found something very important. It is a secret about my grandfather and the vault. I cannot stay at my apartment. It is not safe. Meet me at the old train station at midnight. Come alone. Please hurry. Clara." Arthur looked at his watch. It was 11 o'clock. He had 1 hour. He knew the old train station. It was at the edge of town, near the forest. No trains had stopped there for 20 years. The building was broken and full of shadows. It was a lonely place for a meeting. He did not want to leave the silver clock in the house. He felt that the house was no longer a secret place. He put the clock back into the dark bag. He also took the gold key and the blue notebook. He put on his warmest coat and a pair of dark gloves. He looked at himself in the mirror. He did not look like a quiet gardener anymore. He looked like a man with a mission. He walked out of his back door and moved through the trees. The town was completely silent. The only sound was the wind moving the dry leaves on the ground. The fog was very thick near the forest. Arthur walked for 30 minutes until he saw the dark shape of the station. The station was a skeleton of wood and metal. The roof was falling in, and the windows were all broken. The iron tracks were orange with rust. Arthur stood near the entrance. He looked into the darkness of the main hall. "Clara," he whispered. His voice was lost in the wind. He walked onto the platform. The wooden floor made a low, groaning sound under his boots. He looked around. He saw a small light near the end of the platform. It was the glow of a flashlight. "Clara, is that you?" He asked again, a little louder. The light moved, and a figure stepped out from behind a large wooden pillar. Arthur felt a sense of relief, but also a strange feeling of danger. The figure was wearing a long coat, but it was too dark to see the face. The person began to walk toward him. Arthur walked toward the light at the end of the platform. His heart was beating like a drum in his chest. The figure stood very still behind the wooden pillar. As Arthur got closer, the light from the flashlight hit the person's clothes. He realized with a start that it was not a person at all. It was an old, dark coat hanging on a rusted metal hook. The wind moved the coat, making it look like someone was walking. "Clara!" Arthur called out. His voice was swallowed by the thick fog. There was no answer. The station was completely empty. The silence was heavy and cold. Arthur felt a deep sense of worry. Clara was the one who sent the note. She said it was not safe at her apartment. Why was she not here? He walked to the center of the platform. The wooden boards felt weak under his feet. He moved his flashlight across the floor. Near a row of broken wooden benches, he saw something bright. He walked closer and bent down. It was a blue scarf with colorful patterns. It was the same scarf Clara wore at the grocery store and the cafe. It was lying on the dirty floor, wet from the damp air. Arthur picked up the scarf. It felt cold in his hand. She was here. He whispered to himself. He looked around the dark station. Had someone taken her? Or did she run away and drop the scarf? He felt a wave of guilt. He should not have let her go back to her apartment alone. He sat down on one of the old benches to think. He put the blue scarf in his pocket. As he sat, his foot hit something hard under the bench. The sound was flat and metallic. Arthur knelt on the floor and reached into the darkness under the wooden seat. His fingers touched a cold, heavy object. He pulled it out into the light. It was a small iron box. The box was black and had silver edges. It was very old, and there was a layer of orange rust on the corners. On the top of the box, there was a small symbol carved into the metal. It was the bird with its open wings. The symbol again. Arthur said. He tried to pull the lid of the box, but it was locked. He looked at the lock. It was small and circular. He reached into his other pocket and pulled out the gold key he found in the silver clock. His hands were cold, but he managed to put the key into the lock of the iron box. He held his breath and turned the key. He heard a sharp, clear sound as the lock opened. The lid moved easily now. Arthur felt a mix of excitement and fear. He was standing in a lonely, broken train station at midnight, opening a secret box that belonged to a missing man. He wondered if this box held the answers to Clara's disappearance. He slowly lifted the lid and looked inside. Arthur stared at the iron box in his hands. The metal was very cold against his fingers. He took a deep breath and lifted the lid. The hinges made a slow, dry sound like a door in an old house. A smell of old paper and dry metal filled the air. Inside the box, the space was small, but it was not empty. Arthur held his flashlight between his arm and his body so he could use both hands. The first thing he saw was an old photograph. It was a black and white picture of 3 men. They were standing in front of the Oakhaven town hall. Arthur recognized Thomas Sterling immediately. He looked younger and very confident. Next to him stood Mr. Henderson, the jeweler. He looked the same, but with more hair. The third man was the most surprising. He had a wide smile and sharp eyes. It was the mayor, but he was much younger. They all wore small pins on their coats. The pins were shaped like a bird with open wings. They were all together. Arthur whispered. He felt a cold shiver. The keepers of time were once friends. Now, one was missing, one was terrified, and one was a wolf. Under the photograph, there was a small, heavy coin made of silver. It had the same bird symbol on one side. On the other side, there were numbers. 1950. Arthur realized this was not money for a store. It was a token for the members of the secret group. He put the coin in his pocket next to the gold key. Then, he found a thick piece of paper. It was folded many times. Arthur unfolded it carefully. It was not a letter. It was a list of dates and amounts of money. Beside the numbers, there were names of local businesses and shops. Arthur saw the grocery store, the bakery, and even the library. It looked like a record of money that the keepers of time protected for the town. Suddenly, the silence of the station was broken. From far away, Arthur heard the sound of a car engine. The sound was getting louder. He looked through the broken window of the station. Two bright lights moved through the thick fog. The car was driving slowly down the old dirt road that led to the platform. Arthur's heart began to race. He knew it was not Clara. Clara did not have a car, and she was hiding. He quickly put the photograph and the paper back into the iron box. He closed the lid and heard a soft click. He put the box into his dark bag and pulled the strap over his shoulder. He did not want to be caught in the open. He looked for a place to hide. There was a small door at the back of the platform that led to the old luggage room. He ran toward it. The wooden floor made a loud, groaning sound. Arthur tried to be quiet, but the station was old and every step was noisy. He reached the luggage room and stepped inside. He did not close the door completely. He watched through a small gap. The car stopped in front of the station. A man stepped out. He was tall and wore a heavy police coat. It was Sheriff Miller. He held a large flashlight in his hand and began to walk toward the platform. Arthur stayed behind the heavy wooden door of the luggage room. He watched through the small gap. Sheriff Miller's flashlight moved across the platform like a hungry eye. The bright light hit the old benches and the rusted metal pillars. The sheriff walked slowly. His heavy boots made a deep, steady sound on the wood. He was looking for someone. Arthur! The sheriff called out. His voice was calm, but it was not friendly. I know you are here. I saw your footprints in the mud outside. This is a lonely place for a walk at midnight. Arthur did not move. He did not even breathe. He gripped the iron box inside his bag. He remembered the paper he found inside. He reached into the bag and pulled the list of names out again. He used the very weak light from his own small flashlight, keeping it hidden under his coat. He looked at the bottom of the list. There was a section titled Special Expenses. Under this title, there were 3 names written in red ink. The first name was Mr. Vance. The second name was the mayor. The third name made Arthur's heart stop. It was Sheriff Miller. Beside the sheriff's name, there was a date from 10 years ago. It was October 15th, one day after Mr. Sterling disappeared. Next to the date was a large number, $50,000. Arthur felt a wave of cold anger. The sheriff was not just a helper. He was a partner in the crime. He was paid a lot of money on the very day Mr. Sterling vanished. The Keepers of Time list was not just a record of protection. For some people, it was a record of betrayal. This paper was the proof that the town's highest officials were thieves. Outside, the sheriff was getting closer to the luggage room. He stopped near the door. Arthur could see the shadow of the sheriff's head on the wall. The sheriff reached out and touched the handle of the door. Arthur, come out. Miller said, I just want the box. Give me the box, and you can go home to your garden. Nobody needs to get hurt tonight. Arthur knew the sheriff was lying. If Miller had the evidence, Arthur would never see his garden again. Arthur looked around the dark luggage room. There was a small, square window high up on the back wall. It was too small for a man to climb through easily, but it was his only chance. He quietly moved a wooden crate under the window. The wood made a tiny, dry sound. The sheriff heard it. The door handle began to turn. Arthur stepped onto the crate. He reached for the window. It was stuck with layers of old paint. He pushed with all his strength. The window opened with a sharp sound of breaking wood. Arthur did not wait. He pulled himself up and pushed his body through the opening. He fell into the wet grass on the other side of the building just as the luggage room door crashed open. He heard the sheriff's angry voice behind him, but Arthur was already running into the dark forest. Arthur ran through the trees until his lungs burned. The wet leaves were slippery under his boots, and the branches hit his face like thin whips. He did not use his flashlight because he did not want Sheriff Miller to see him. He moved by the pale light of the moon. Finally, he reached the edge of the woods near his own garden. He stopped and watched the street. It was empty and silent. He ran to his back door, stepped inside, and locked it with 3 turns of the key. He fell to the floor, breathing hard. He was safe for now, but he knew the sheriff would come to his house soon. He took the dark bag with the iron box and the silver clock and hid it in the kitchen cupboard behind some heavy metal pots. He sat in the dark living room, watching the street through the curtains. He was shaking from the cold and the fear. Suddenly, there was a quiet knock at the back door. It was not a heavy, loud knock like the sheriff's. It was a very soft, rhythmic sound. Arthur grabbed his heavy metal flashlight. He walked to the door and looked through the small glass window. He was surprised to see a small, older man wearing a thick grey coat. It was Mr. Henderson, the jeweler. Arthur opened the door and pulled the old man inside quickly. "Mr. Henderson, what are you doing here? It is almost 2 o'clock in the morning. It is very dangerous for you to be out." Henderson sat at the kitchen table. He looked very tired, and his hands were trembling. "I could not stay in my shop, Arthur. After you showed me the clock this afternoon, I could not sleep. I have been a coward for 10 years, but seeing that silver bird again changed something inside me. I knew I had to find you and tell you the truth." Arthur sat across from him. "The sheriff tried to catch me at the train station. He is part of the mayor's plan. I found a list of names. Mr. Henderson, your name was on the list of the keepers of time." Henderson sighed and looked at his lap. "It is true. I was one of them. There were 4 of us. Thomas Sterling, myself, the mayor, and an old teacher named George. We were friends. We swore to protect the town's future. We used the silver clock and its hidden mechanisms to keep the bank records and the town's gold safe." "What happened to the friendship?" Arthur asked softly. "Greed," Henderson said. "The mayor wanted the money for himself. He wanted to buy power. Thomas refused to help him. Then, one night, Thomas was gone. The mayor told me that if I spoke, my shop would burn and I would disappear too. I was afraid. Arthur, I am an old man, and I just wanted to live in peace." Arthur showed him the iron box and the old photograph of the 3 friends. Henderson's eyes filled with tears when he saw Thomas Sterling's face. "I am so sorry I didn't help him. But I will help you now. I know where the secret entrance is. It is not just a story. It is real, and it is hidden inside my own shop." Arthur felt a spark of hope. He was not alone anymore. "We have to find Clara," Arthur said. "She went to the station to meet me, but she vanished. I found her scarf on the floor. Then we must move fast," Henderson replied, standing up with new energy. "The mayor thinks he has won, but he does not know we have the key. Let's go to the shop. We can reach the tunnels from there." Arthur and Mr. Henderson left the house through the back door. The town was very dark. The streetlights were far apart, and the shadows were deep. They did not speak. They walked through the narrow paths between the houses. Arthur held the dark bag with the silver clock very tightly. Mr. Henderson walked with a small lamp, but he did not turn it on. He knew the way by heart. They reached the jewelry shop. The street was empty. Mr. Henderson pulled out a large ring of keys. He opened the front door quickly. The small bell above the door made a sharp sound in the silence. They stepped inside and locked the door behind them. The shop was full of the quiet ticking of many clocks. In the dark, it felt like the shop was alive. "Wait here," Mr. Henderson whispered. He walked to the back of the shop. Arthur followed him. They went past the glass counters and the repair desk. They reached a large wooden shelf full of old books about watches and gems. Mr. Henderson reached for a heavy book with a red cover. He did not pull it out. Instead, he pushed it into the shelf. Arthur heard a low, grinding sound of metal moving against stone. The entire shelf began to move slowly to the right. Behind the shelf, there was a small, narrow door made of iron. "This is it," Henderson said. His voice was full of emotion. "Thomas and I built this many years ago. It leads to the old coal tunnels." Arthur looked at the iron door. In the center, there was a round hole. It was the same size as the base of the silver clock. "What do we do now?" Arthur asked. "The clock is not just a key for a box," Henderson explained. "It is the key for this door. Put the silver clock into the circle." Arthur took the silver clock out of his bag. He felt the cold metal in his hands. He placed the clock into the round hole in the iron door. It was a perfect fit. Suddenly, the clock began to make a sound. It was a rhythmic, steady sound. For the first time, the silver hands began to move. They moved quickly, turning around the white face of the clock. When the hands reached 12 o'clock, there was a loud metal click. The iron door opened a few inches. A cold, damp wind came from the darkness behind the door. It smelled like wet stone and old earth. "We must go down now," Henderson said. He finally turned on his small lamp. The light showed a set of steep stone stairs going down into the ground. Arthur felt a moment of fear. He looked at the quiet street through the shop window, then at the dark stairs. He thought of Clara and Mr. Sterling. He took a deep breath. "I am ready," he said. They stepped through the iron door. Arthur took the silver clock back from the wall, and the door closed behind them. They were now under the town, in the secret world of the Keepers of Time. Arthur and Mr. Henderson began their walk down the stone stairs. The stairs were narrow and wet. Arthur held the wall with one hand. The stone felt slimy and cold. Mr. Henderson held the lamp in front of them. The yellow light was small. It did not go very far into the darkness. Every step they took made a soft, echoing sound. At the bottom of the stairs, they reached a long tunnel. The walls were made of old red bricks. Some of the bricks were broken. Water dripped from the ceiling, making small pools on the floor. Arthur could hear the constant sound of water hitting the stone. It was a lonely and heavy sound. "The tunnels are very old," Mr. Henderson whispered. His voice sounded loud in the quiet space. "They connect all the important buildings in Oakhaven. The library, the bank, the town hall, and the Sterling house." They began to walk. The air was thin and hard to breathe. Arthur felt like the weight of the whole town was above his head. He looked at the walls. Every few meters, he saw a small metal plate with a bird symbol. These plates showed them the way. "Stop," Henderson suddenly said. He turned off his lamp. The darkness was total. Arthur could not see his own hand. He stayed perfectly still. Then, he heard it. From somewhere far ahead in the tunnel, there was a sound. It was the sound of heavy boots walking on the stone floor. There was more than one person. "Is it the sheriff?" Arthur whispered, his heart racing. "Maybe," Henderson replied. Or the mayor's men. They must know about the tunnels. We are not the only ones down here. The sounds of the boots became louder. Arthur saw a faint light reflecting off the wet walls in the distance. The light was moving toward them. He looked around for a place to hide. There was a small opening in the brick wall where a pipe used to be. It was just big enough for 2 people to stand inside. Arthur and Henderson stepped into the dark opening. They pressed their bodies against the cold bricks. Arthur held the bag with the silver clock against his chest. He prayed the clock would not make any sound. A group of 3 men walked past their hiding place. They were carrying bright flashlights and heavy tools. Arthur recognized the man in the front. It was Mr. Vance, the man in the dark suit. He looked angry. His face was covered in dust, but his eyes were sharp. "We have to find the vault door before the morning," Vance said to the other men. "The mayor is losing his patience. If the girl doesn't talk, we find it ourselves." Arthur's heart jumped. Vance mentioned a girl. That had to be Clara. She was alive, but she was a prisoner. The men continued walking until their light disappeared around a corner. "They have Clara," Arthur whispered. "We have to follow them." Henderson nodded. He looked worried but determined. "They are going toward the Sterling house. That is where the main vault is located. We must be very quiet." Arthur and Mr. Henderson waited until the light from the men's flashlights was completely gone. The tunnel returned to a heavy, suffocating darkness. Arthur's hands were cold, but his mind was sharp. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the silver compass he had found in the secret drawer of the Sterling desk. "Mr. Henderson, look," Arthur whispered. He turned on his small flashlight for a second, keeping the beam low. The needle of the compass was spinning rapidly. Then it suddenly stopped. It didn't point toward the north. It pointed directly at a solid brick wall to their left. "That's impossible," Henderson said, squinting through his large glasses. "There is nothing but earth and stone behind those bricks. The main path continues straight toward the Sterling house cellar." The letter said the compass points to the truth. Arthur reminded him. He walked over to the wall. He began to run his fingers over the old, damp bricks. He felt the rough texture and the cold moisture. Near the center, he felt something different, a small, smooth indentation in the shape of a triangle. He looked at the base of the silver clock inside his bag. On the bottom of the clock, there was a small triangular peg. "Help me hold the light," Arthur said. He lifted the heavy silver clock and pressed the triangular base into the wall. He pushed with all his strength. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, a deep, low rumble echoed through the tunnel. The brick wall didn't swing open. It slid downward into the floor, revealing a hidden passage that was much cleaner and drier than the main tunnel. "I never knew about this," Henderson gasped. Thomas kept some secrets even from his fellow keepers. They stepped into the new passage. The floor here was made of smooth white stone, and the walls were lined with copper pipes. As they walked, Arthur heard a faint sound. It wasn't the sound of dripping water or heavy boots. It was a woman's voice, muffled and distant. "Clara," Arthur whispered. He ran forward, no longer caring about being quiet. The passage opened into a small, circular room. In the center of the room, Clara was tied to a wooden chair. Her face was pale and she looked exhausted. But she was alive. Standing over her was Mr. Vance, holding a heavy iron key and a pair of dark gloves. "I will ask you one more time, Miss Sterling," Vance said, his voice echoing off the curved walls. "Where is the final code? Your grandfather didn't just leave a clock. There is a sequence of numbers. Where did he hide it?" Clara lifted her head. Her eyes were red, but they were full of fire. "I told you. I don't know." My grandfather protected the town from people like you. Even if I knew, I would never tell." Vance raised his hand as if to strike her, but Arthur stepped out of the shadows. "Let her go, Vance." Vance spun around, his eyes widening in surprise. He looked at Arthur, then at the silver clock in Arthur's hands. A slow, cruel smile spread across his face. "Well, well, the gardener has finally arrived. And he brought the key with him. You've saved us a lot of time, Arthur." Vance took a step toward Arthur, his eyes fixed on the silver clock. He ignored Mr. Henderson completely, as if the old jeweler was just another piece of dusty furniture. The circular room felt smaller now, the air thick with the smell of old copper and Vance's expensive cologne. "Give me the clock, Arthur," Vance said, his voice dropping to a smooth, dangerous whisper. "You've played the hero long enough. You're a gardener. You grow roses and trim hedges. You don't belong in this world of secrets and shadows." "I belong here more than you do," Arthur replied, his voice surprisingly steady. He stepped closer to Clara, keeping the clock pulled back. "This town isn't a bank for the mayor to rob. Mr. Sterling spent his life protecting Oakhaven's history. You're just trying to steal it." Vance laughed, a dry sound that echoed unpleasantly. "History. History is for the dead. The mayor wants to build a new Oakhaven, a modern city with glass towers and high-speed rails. To do that, he needs the gold Thomas Sterling hid. That history is going to pay for the future. The future you want will destroy this town." Mr. Henderson shouted, stepping forward. Thomas knew the mayor's heart was cold. That's why he hid the vault. It wasn't just money. It was the land deeds, the original charters. If you take them, the people lose everything. Vance's face twisted into a mask of anger. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small, black pistol. Clara gasped, her eyes wide with terror. "I'm done talking. The clock, Arthur. Now, or the girl pays for your stubbornness." Arthur looked at Clara. Her lips moved silently, telling him no. But Arthur couldn't let her be hurt. He looked at the silver clock. The hands were still moving, ticking toward a time only the clock knew. He noticed something he hadn't seen before. The bird symbol on the floor of the circular room was exactly the same size as the clock's base. "All right," Arthur said, holding his hands up. "I'll give it to you. But let her go first." "The clock first," Vance demanded. "Set it on the floor and slide it over." Arthur slowly knelt down. He didn't slide the clock toward Vance. Instead, he placed it directly onto the bird symbol in the center of the floor. As the silver base touched the stone, the ticking sound changed. It became faster and louder, like a heartbeat. Suddenly, a heavy thud sounded from the passage behind them. Sheriff Miller stepped into the room, his face red and covered in sweat. He was holding his own weapon, but he wasn't looking at Arthur. He was looking at Vance. "The mayor is losing his nerve, Vance," the sheriff growled. He saw the lights in the tunnels. "He thinks the town is waking up. We need to finish this now." "I have the key, Miller," Vance said, pointing to the clock on the floor. "The vault is opening." The floor began to vibrate. The circular wall started to rotate, the copper pipes humming with pressure. Arthur realized the entire room was a giant lock. He lunged toward Clara, his fingers fumbling with the ropes around her wrists. "Henderson, help me," Arthur yelled. As the room spun, a section of the wall disappeared, revealing a massive iron door with 3 separate locks. Above the door, a message was carved in deep, bold letters. "Only the truth remains when time runs out." The rotation of the circular room stopped with a violent jolt. The massive iron door stood before them, cold and imposing. Vance and Sheriff Miller stepped back, momentarily stunned by the sheer scale of the mechanism. The humming of the copper pipes faded into a low, expectant hiss. "The 3 locks," Vance whispered, his greed overcoming his fear. He pointed his pistol at the iron door. "We have the silver clock, but look, there are 3 separate keyholes. One for a clock, one for a coin, and one for a key." Arthur, having finally freed Clara's hands, helped her stand. She leaned against him, her breath coming in short, jagged gasps. Mr. Henderson stood beside them, his eyes fixed on the door he had helped design but never actually seen. "You don't understand, Vance," Henderson said, his voice echoing in the chamber. "It's not just about having the items. It's about the people who hold them. The keepers were a circle. You can't open the vault alone." "Watch me," Vance snapped. He grabbed the silver clock from the floor and shoved it into the first circular indentation. The clock clicked into place, and the first of the 3 iron bolts retracted. Sheriff Miller stepped forward, his eyes narrow. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, silver coin, the same type Arthur had found in the iron box at the station. "I've had this for 10 years. Miller growled. "Sterling gave it to me when I was just a deputy. I thought it was a bribe. I didn't know it was a key." He pressed the coin into the second slot. The second bolt slid back. Only 1 lock remained. The central one. Vance turned to Arthur, his face twisted in a desperate grin. "The gold key. Arthur, I know you have it. Give it to me, and we all walk out of here rich. The mayor will make sure you're taken care of." Arthur reached into his pocket. He felt the weight of the gold key, its metal warm against his palm. He looked at Clara, then at the wolf standing before him. He thought about the blue notebook, the list of names, and the honest man who had disappeared to protect the town's soul. The message above the door. Arthur said, pointing to the carving, "Only the truth remains when time runs out." He looked Vance in the eye. "The truth is, you weren't invited to this circle, and neither was the mayor. Give me the key." Vance screamed, stepping toward Arthur. Suddenly, the silver clock began to chime. It wasn't a gentle sound. It was a loud, brassy alarm that vibrated through the very floor beneath them. The hands on the clock's face began to spin backward at a blur. "What's happening?" Miller shouted, looking around as the walls began to groan. "The failsafe," Henderson whispered, a look of realization dawning on his face. "If the locks are turned by those who don't hold the truth of the keepers, the vault doesn't open. It seals." The floor began to tilt. Water started to seep from the ceiling, not in drips, but in steady streams. The tunnels were beginning to flood. "Arthur, the key!" Clara cried out, pointing to a small, hidden keyhole near the base of the door, one that Vance and Miller had missed. "It's not in the center. It's at the foundation." Arthur lunged forward, dodging Vance's outstretched arm. He dove toward the floor as the water rose around his ankles. He found the tiny, hidden slot near the bottom hinge. He pushed the gold key in and turned it hard to the left. As Arthur turned the gold key, the massive iron door did not open outward. Instead, it dissolved into a series of sliding plates, revealing a hidden room filled with a warm, golden light. This was not the cold, artificial light of a flashlight, but the glow of thousands of candles that had been burning for years in the oxygen-rich chamber. Inside, the room was not filled with piles of gold coins or jewels. It was a grand archive. The walls were lined with heavy glass cases protecting the original land deeds of Oakhaven, the town's founding charter, and the records of every family that had lived there for 100 years. In the center of the room sat a man in a high-backed chair, his hair white as snow, reading a thick book. "Grandfather," Clara whispered, her voice breaking the sudden silence. Thomas Sterling looked up. He didn't look like a prisoner or a ghost. He looked like a king in a hidden palace. "Clara," he said, his voice deep and steady. "I knew you would find the way. And you brought the new keeper with you." Vance and Sheriff Miller stood frozen at the threshold. The water from the flood was still rising in the outer tunnel, but it could not enter the archive. An invisible pressure seemed to keep the moisture away. Vance raised his pistol, his eyes wild with greed. "The money. Sterling. Where is the gold?" Thomas Sterling stood up slowly. "The gold was spent long ago, Mr. Vance. It paid for the hospitals, the schools, and the parks you see above your head. The true wealth of Oakhaven is sitting in these cases. The proof that this land belongs to the people, not to the mayor's developers." "Lies!" Vance screamed. He pulled the trigger, but the gun only made a dull click. In the presence of the archive, the tools of violence seemed to fail. Sheriff Miller looked at the documents in the cases. He saw his own family name on a deed from 50 years ago. He looked at his badge, then at the rising water outside. A look of deep shame crossed his face. He lowered his head and dropped his weapon into the water. "It's over, Vance," Miller said quietly. "It is indeed over." Thomas Sterling said. He looked at Arthur. "Arthur, you have shown the greatest quality of a keeper. The courage to seek the truth when it is dangerous. The silver clock led you here, but your heart brought you in." Thomas reached into a small stone alcove and pulled a heavy lever. A hidden lift, powered by the town's ancient water system, began to rise from the floor. "The tunnels will flood to wash away the greed of the past," Thomas explained. "But we are going up." Arthur, Clara, Mr. Henderson, and even a silent, defeated Sheriff Miller stepped onto the lift. Vance tried to jump on, but the platform moved too fast, leaving him screaming in the rising dark as the iron plates of the vault sealed shut forever, protecting the records from anyone who would seek to destroy them. They emerged into the light of a new morning. The lift let them out behind the high altar of the Oakhaven church. The sun was rising, casting long, golden rays through the stained glass windows. The air was fresh and smelled of pine and rain. Thomas Sterling stepped out into the town he had protected for so long. He looked at the silver bird clock, now resting in Arthur's hands. The hands had stopped moving. The work was done. "The mayor will be gone by noon," Thomas said, looking toward the town hall. "The documents we saved will see to that. But Oakhaven needs a new kind of keeper now. Someone who knows the value of a quiet garden and a loud truth." Arthur looked at the clock, then at Clara, who was smiling through her tears. He felt the weight of the silver, but it no longer felt heavy. It felt like a part of him. "I think I can manage that," Arthur said. As the town began to wake up, the bells of the clock tower began to ring, clear and bright, announcing the start of a day that Oakhaven would never forget. The bells of the church continued to ring, their bronze voices echoing across the valley and waking the residents of Oakhaven. For Arthur, the sound was no longer a simple mark of the hour. It was a victory song. He stood on the stone steps of the church, the silver clock cradled in his arms. Beside him, Thomas Sterling looked at the town with the eyes of a man seeing a long-lost friend. The sun had fully cleared the horizon, turning the morning mist into a shimmering veil of gold. It didn't take long for a crowd to gather. People in bathrobes and heavy coats stepped onto their porches, drawn by the unusual bell ringing. When they saw the tall, white-haired figure of Thomas Sterling standing in the light, a hush fell over the town square. Many of the older residents rubbed their eyes, convinced they were seeing a ghost. Mrs. Gable, the librarian, was the first to run across the cobblestones, her face a mask of shock and joy. "Thomas!" she cried, her voice cracking. Thomas stepped down to meet her, offering a warm smile that seemed to erase 10 years of hardship. It is. Margaret. I've been away too long, but the time was not wasted. As the townspeople crowded around, Arthur felt a hand on his shoulder. It was Clara. She looked exhausted, her clothes stained with the mud of the tunnels, but her eyes were bright. "We did it, Arthur," she whispered. "But look at the town hall. It's not over yet." Arthur followed her gaze. Across the square, the heavy oak doors of the town hall swung open. Mayor Thorne stepped out, flanked by two nervous-looking deputies. His face was a deep, angry red, and he clutched a leather briefcase to his chest. He stopped at the top of the stairs, his eyes darting from Thomas to the silver bird in Arthur's hands. He knew immediately that his secret had been unburied. "This is an illegal gathering," the mayor shouted, his voice high and thin. "Sterling is a trespasser. He's been hiding for a decade to avoid his debts. Deputies, arrest that man and seize that clock." The deputies didn't move. They looked at the townspeople, then at Thomas Sterling, and finally at Sheriff Miller, who stepped out from behind the church altar, his head bowed in shame. Miller looked at the mayor and shook his head. "It's over, Thorne. The vault is open. The people know about the deeds. They know about the money you diverted to your own accounts." The crowd began to murmur, the sound growing into a roar of anger. The mayor's power, built on a foundation of lies and fear, vanished in an instant. He turned to flee back into the building, but the townspeople were faster. They formed a human wall, preventing his escape. Arthur watched as the man who had ruled Oakhaven with an iron fist crumbled into a terrified shadow. "The clock stays with Arthur," Thomas Sterling announced, his voice carrying over the noise. "He is the one who saw the truth when others turned away. He is the new keeper." The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. The mayor had been taken into custody by state authorities, and Sheriff Miller had resigned, handing over his badge to a young officer who had not been part of the corruption. Thomas Sterling moved back into his house across the street from Arthur, though it would take weeks to clean away the 10 years of dust and neglect. Arthur sat at his kitchen table, the silver bird clock ticking softly beside a cup of tea. He felt like a different person. The quiet, solitary gardener was gone, replaced by someone the town looked to for guidance. Even the grocery store clerk treated him with a new kind of respect. But Arthur wasn't interested in fame. He was interested in the unfinished business of the keepers of time. Clara arrived at his door at noon. She carried a stack of folders salvaged from the mayor's office. "My grandfather wants us to see this," she said, spreading the papers across the table. While the vault held the big documents, the land deeds and charters, the mayor kept a private ledger in a floor safe. It wasn't just about Oakhaven. Arthur leaned over the ledger. It was a record of payments and secret meetings. As he turned the pages, he saw a name that made his blood run cold. "The Iron Pendulum. What is that?" he asked. "Grandfather says the keepers of time weren't the only ones," Clara explained. "They were part of a network of small towns, each protecting a different resource. Oakhaven protected the land and history. But the Iron Pendulum, they are different. They are a group that believes time shouldn't just be protected, it should be controlled." Arthur looked at the silver clock. Its hands were moving perfectly now, but he noticed a small, faint scratching on the back of the casing that he hadn't seen before. He took his magnifying glass and looked closer. It wasn't a scratch. It was a set of coordinates. "These aren't Oakhaven coordinates," Arthur said, his heart beginning to pace. "They point toward the mountains, about 50 miles north of here, to a place called Blackwood Ridge." "The ledger mentions Blackwood Ridge," Clara said, her voice dropping. "It says that the mayor was sending a portion of our town's funds there every month. Not to a bank, but to a master of the works. Arthur, I think Vance wasn't just working for the mayor. I think the mayor was working for someone else. Arthur realized then that the mystery of the silver bird was only the first chapter. The vault in Oakhaven had been saved, but the iron pendulum was still out there, and they were likely wondering why their payments had stopped. If the mayor was just a wolf as the letter said, then the master of the works was something much larger, a hunter. We can't just sit here, Arthur said, standing up. If these people are waiting for money that isn't coming, they'll come looking for it. We need to find this master before he finds us. The thought of Vance haunted Arthur's sleep. He remembered the man's eyes as the water rose in the tunnels, the look of a cornered animal that would do anything to survive. While the authorities had searched the accessible parts of the flooded tunnels, they had found no body. The iron plates of the vault had sealed, but there were other exits, other pipes, and other secrets. Arthur spent the afternoon in his garden, trying to find peace in the soil, but he couldn't stop looking at the trees at the edge of his property. He felt as if he were being watched. He decided to visit Mr. Henderson at the jewelry shop to see if the old man knew anything about the iron pendulum. As he walked down the quiet street, he noticed a black car parked in the shadows of an alleyway. It wasn't the mayor's car. It was older, a heavy sedan with tinted windows. Arthur slowed his pace, his hand moving to the gold key he now wore on a chain around his neck. He didn't turn around, but he used the reflection in a shop window to see. The car door opened a crack, then closed quickly. He ducked into Henderson's shop, the bell ringing sharply. "Mr. Henderson," he called out. The shop was empty. The tools were laid out on the counter, and a half-repaired watch was still ticking. But the old jeweler was nowhere to be seen. Arthur walked to the back, toward the hidden shelf that led to the tunnels. The shelf was slightly ajar. "Henderson," Arthur whispered. He pushed the shelf open. The iron door was closed, but a piece of fabric was caught in the frame. Arthur pulled it out. It was a strip of black leather, part of a glove. He felt a wave of nausea. Vance was alive, and he had come for the jeweler. Arthur didn't go down into the tunnels alone this time. He ran to the new sheriff's office. Within minutes, the young sheriff and 2 officers were at the shop. They searched the building, but Henderson was gone. On the jeweler's workbench, they found a single object that hadn't been there before, a small, blackened gear from a clock. It had been crushed by something very heavy. "It's a message," Clara said, appearing at the shop door. She had heard the sirens. The iron pendulum. They break what they can't control. Arthur looked at the crushed gear. He felt a surge of protective anger. Henderson had risked his life to help Arthur, and now he was paying the price. Arthur knew he couldn't wait for the state police or the local authorities to figure out the puzzle. The coordinates in the silver clock were calling to him. "Get your coat, Clara," Arthur said, his voice hard. "We're going to Blackwood Ridge. If Vance has Henderson, that's where he's taking him. He knows I have the silver bird, and he knows I'll come for my friend." "It's a trap, Arthur," Clara warned. "I know," Arthur replied. "But they don't know that I have the ledger. They think I'm just a gardener who got lucky. It's time they learned that a keeper knows how to protect what's his." The drive to Blackwood Ridge took them through winding mountain roads, where the trees grew so thick they blocked out the afternoon sun. Arthur drove his old truck, the engine straining against the steep incline. The silver bird sat on the seat between him and Clara, wrapped in a thick wool blanket. It felt like a ticking heart, a companion in the growing cold. "Do you really think my grandfather didn't know about the others?" Clara asked, staring out at the grey cliffs. "I think he knew," Arthur said. "But I think he also knew that the more people who knew the secret, the more dangerous it became. He was trying to keep Oakhaven isolated, to keep the rot from spreading. But the mayor brought the rot inside." The air grew thin and smelled of pine and ancient stone. They reached the coordinates just as the sun began to dip behind the peaks. The GPS led them to a dead-end road that ended at the mouth of an abandoned iron mine. A large, rusted sign hung from a chain. "Stay out. Dangerous gas." Arthur parked the truck behind a cluster of boulders. He took the silver clock and the gold key. "The gas sign is a lie," he whispered. "Look at the ground." In the dirt, there were fresh tire tracks. Wide, heavy tires from a modern vehicle. Someone had been coming and going from the mine frequently. They followed the tracks on foot, moving quietly through the brush. The entrance to the mine was a dark moor in the side of the mountain. But as they got closer, Arthur realized it wasn't a mine at all. Behind the rusted iron gates, the stone had been carved into smooth, geometric shapes. This wasn't a place of mining. It was a place of engineering. They heard the sound of a generator humming deep inside, a low vibration that shook the soles of their boots. "Wait," Clara whispered, pulling Arthur behind a stone pillar. A man walked out of the entrance. He wasn't wearing a suit or a uniform. He wore a heavy apron over work clothes, and his arms were covered in grease. He was carrying a crate of brass parts. He looked like a clockmaker, but his face was grim and tired. He looked around, sighed, and then went back inside. "They're building something," Arthur said. They moved closer to the entrance. As they peered inside, they saw a massive cavern lit by electric lights. In the center of the cavern was a machine the size of a house. It was a forest of gears, pendulums, and rotating cylinders. It looked like a clock, but it was too big to tell the time. It looked like a heart. And there, tied to a chair near the base of the machine, was Mr. Henderson. Standing over him was Vance, his arm in a sling and his face scarred from the tunnel flood. But Vance wasn't the one in charge. He was talking to a woman in a grey lab coat who was adjusting a valve on the machine. "The silver bird is the missing regulator," the woman said, her voice echoing. "Without it, the master's great clock will never synchronize. Tell the mayor to hurry. The mayor is in jail." Vance growled. "But the gardener is coming. I can feel it." Arthur felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. The great clock wasn't just a machine. It was a weapon. He didn't know how it worked yet, but the way the woman looked at it, with a mix of fear and worship, told him everything he needed to know. The iron pendulum wanted to synchronize something much larger than a town. "We need a plan," Clara whispered. "We can't just walk in there. Vance has a gun, and there are probably more workers in the back." Arthur looked at the silver bird in his hands. He remembered what Thomas Sterling had said. Time is the only thing we cannot buy back. He also remembered the mechanism inside the clock. It wasn't just a key. It was a regulator. It controlled the flow of energy. "The machine needs this clock to work," Arthur said. "But what if the clock is set to the wrong time? If this machine is as precise as it looks, a single second of difference could tear it apart." "You want to sabotage it?" Clara asked. "I want to finish what the keepers started," Arthur said. "They protected time. This machine, it's trying to trap it." Arthur began to adjust the hands of the silver clock. He didn't use the normal winding stem. He used the gold key in a tiny slot he had discovered on the side of the casing. As he turned the key, the ticking of the clock changed. It became erratic, a syncopated beat that sounded like a racing heart. "Now," Arthur said, "I'm going to go down there. I'm going to show them the clock. When they get distracted, you find a way to get Henderson out." "Arthur, no," Clara said, grabbing his arm. "They'll kill you." "They won't," Arthur said with a grim smile. "They need the clock too much. And they don't know that this clock is now a ticking bomb for their machine." Arthur stepped out from behind the pillar and walked into the light of the cavern. He held the silver bird high above his head. The silver reflected the electric lights, casting dancing shadows on the walls. "Vance!" Arthur shouted. His voice was steady, filled with the authority of a man who had finally accepted his destiny. "I have what you want. But if you touch Henderson, I'll drop it into the gears of your precious machine right now." Vance spun around, his hand flying to his holster. The woman in the grey coat froze, her eyes widening as she saw the silver clock. The entire cavern went silent, the only sound the massive thrum, thrum, thrum of the great clock. "Bring it here, gardener," Vance said, a cruel light in his eyes. "And maybe I'll let the old man live long enough to see the world change." Arthur walked forward, his boots clicking on the metal floor. He was a simple man from Oakhaven, a man who liked roses and quiet mornings. But as he stepped toward the heart of the enemy, he felt the strength of every keeper who had come before him. The game was no longer about a town. It was about the world's time, and Arthur was the only one holding the key. Arthur stood in the center of the cavern, the immense weight of the great clock looming over him like a mechanical god. The air hummed with a frequency that made his teeth ache. Vance stood 10 paces away, his pistol leveled at Arthur's chest. The woman in the grey lab coat, whom Vance called Dr. Aries, watched the silver clock in Arthur's hands with an expression bordering on hunger. "You're a brave man, Arthur," Vance said, his voice grating against the steady rhythm of the machine. "Or a very stupid one. You think walking into the lion's den makes you a hero? It just makes you dinner." "I'm not here to be a hero, Vance," Arthur replied, his eyes darting to Mr. Henderson. The old jeweler looked battered, his glasses missing, but he gave Arthur a small, nearly invisible nod. "I'm here to make a trade. You want the regulator. I want my friend and safe passage for the 3 of us out of this mountain." Dr. Aries stepped forward, her heels clicking sharply on the steel grate. "The silver bird is more than a regulator, Arthur. It is the heart of the pendulum's design. It contains the original frequency of the Oakhaven meridian. Without it, this machine is just a pile of very expensive gears. With it, we can synchronize the time of every bank, every stock exchange, and every government office in the state. We can stop the world or make it run at our pace." Arthur felt a chill. The iron pendulum wasn't just stealing money. They were stealing the flow of life itself. If they controlled the clocks, they controlled the heartbeat of civilization. "If it's that important," Arthur said, "then you won't mind if I hold on to it until we're at the truck." "I don't think so," Vance sneered, thumbing the hammer of his gun. "You place it in the cradle now, or I start by taking the old man's fingers." "I know you, Arthur. You're a man of conscience. That's your biggest weakness." Out of the corner of his eye, Arthur saw a shadow move behind the massive brass cooling pipes. It was Clara. She was moving with the silent grace of someone who had spent her childhood playing in the hidden corners of the Sterling house. She was circling toward Henderson's chair. Arthur needed to keep their attention fixed on him. "All right," Arthur said, his voice trembling slightly, half from fear, half from the vibrations of the floor. "I'll put it in. But I do it myself. I'm a gardener, remember? I have a gentle touch. If you grab it and drop it, your great clock becomes a giant paperweight." Dr. Aries nodded to Vance. "Let him. He can't do anything. The cradle is integrated into the primary drive. Once the clock is seated, it locks magnetically. He won't be able to pull it out." Arthur walked toward the machine. Every step felt like he was walking into a storm. The great clock was a masterpiece of Victorian engineering and modern electronics, a terrifying hybrid of old and new. He reached the central console, where a silver-lined indentation waited. This was the moment. He had adjusted the silver bird's internal timing by exactly 4 seconds. In a system this complex, 4 seconds was an eternity. Arthur's hands shook as he lifted the silver bird toward the cradle. The proximity of the great clock seemed to awaken the small device. Its silver wings vibrated, and the ticking sound it produced grew loud and metallic. "Careful," Dr. Aries whispered, leaning in. Her eyes were fixed on the clock's face. "The alignment must be precise. If the gears don't mesh on the first rotation, the feedback will fry the regulator's core." Arthur looked at the silver hands. They were spinning backward, fueled by the gold key's tension. He realized that the 4-second sabotage wasn't just about time. It was about direction. He was feeding a negative rhythm into a system designed for a positive flow. As he lowered the clock into the cradle, he saw Clara reach Henderson. She was using a small pocket knife to saw through the thick ropes. Vance was still watching Arthur, but his ego was blinded by the sight of the prize. He was already imagining the power he would wield. The silver bird seated itself perfectly. Immediately, a blue light pulsed from the base of the clock, traveling up through the brass pipes of the great clock. The machine's low hum transformed into a high-pitched whine. "It's working!" Dr. Aries cried, her face illuminated by the sapphire glow. "The synchronization has begun. Look at the dials." Across the cavern, rows of ancient-looking gauges began to spin. The massive iron pendulum at the back of the machine, 20 feet tall and heavy as a locomotive, began to swing. Tick, tock, tick, tock. Arthur backed away from the console. "There. It's in. Now, release Henderson." Vance didn't look at him. He was staring at the machine, a look of religious awe on his face. "In a moment, Gardener. I want to see the first pulse." "Clara, now!" Arthur shouted. Clara pulled Henderson to his feet. The old man stumbled, his legs numb, but they began to move toward the side exit. Vance finally snapped out of his trance, his eyes darting from Arthur to the escaping prisoners. He raised his gun, but before he could fire, the great clock let out a sound like a dying animal. The high-pitched whine became a series of violent cracks. Sparks began to shower from the upper rafters. The blue light turned a sickly, flickering purple. The massive iron pendulum didn't just swing, it jerked, its rhythm broken by the silver bird's contrary heartbeat. "What did you do?" Dr. Aries screamed, running toward the console. "The frequency is inverted. The regulators are melting." "I told you," Arthur said, his voice cold. "I'm a gardener. I know how to pull weeds." The cavern floor shook as a massive gear, 6 feet in diameter, sheared off its axle and crashed into the steel floor. The great clock was no longer a machine. It was a crashing wave of metal and energy. Arthur turned and ran toward Clara and Henderson, the heat of the malfunctioning machine hot on his back. The cavern was a chaos of screaming metal and exploding light. The great clock, designed to be the ultimate instrument of order, was tearing itself apart with mechanical fury. Arthur reached Clara and Henderson just as another explosion rocked the chamber, sending a cloud of steam and soot into the air. "This way," Henderson wheezed, pointing to a small service tunnel he had noticed during his captivity. "It's a ventilation shaft. It leads to the upper ridges." "Arthur, get down," Clara yelled. A copper pipe, pressurized to the breaking point, burst from the wall, whipping through the air exactly where Arthur had been standing a second before. He scrambled to his feet, his heart pounding. Behind them, he saw Vance. The man was covered in dust, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. He was no longer a cool, calculating criminal. He was a man who had lost everything in a single tick of a clock. "You're not leaving," Vance roared, firing his pistol. The bullet sparked off a metal pillar near Arthur's head. "Keep going," Arthur told Clara. "Get Henderson to the truck. I'll be right behind you." "Don't be a fool, Arthur," Clara cried. "Go." Arthur ducked behind a heavy wooden crate as Vance fired again. The cavern was filling with smoke, making it hard to see. Arthur realized he didn't need to fight Vance. He just needed to survive the machine's collapse. The great clock was now a whirlpool of spinning parts. The massive pendulum had broken its primary chain and was swinging wildly, smashing into the support columns of the cave. Arthur looked back at the central console. The silver bird was still there, glowing with an intense, white light. It was the only thing holding the core together. If he could retrieve it, he could stop the iron pendulum from ever rebuilding this nightmare. But the heat was becoming unbearable. Vance was closing in, his shadow long and terrifying against the flickering light. But then, the great clock gave its final groan. The massive iron pendulum swung one last time, striking the central housing with the force of a falling building. The shockwave knocked Arthur off his feet and sent Vance flying backward into a pile of discarded gears. Arthur saw his chance. He scrambled to the console, his fingers burning as he grabbed the silver bird. The magnetic lock had failed during the power surge. He shoved the clock into his coat and ran for the service tunnel. He didn't look back to see if Vance was still moving. He didn't look back at Dr. Aries, who was weeping over her broken god. He only looked toward the small circle of light far above that signaled the way out. The climb through the ventilation shaft was a nightmare of cramped spaces and jagged rocks. Arthur could hear the mountain groaning below him. The destruction of the great clock had triggered a series of structural failures within the mine. Each step felt like a gamble against a cave-in. Finally, he burst out into the cold mountain air. He was a mile away from the main entrance, standing on a rocky ledge overlooking the valley. Below him, the ground buckled. A massive plume of dust and smoke erupted from the mine's mouth, followed by the muffled description of the cavern collapsing. The great clock was buried under millions of tons of stone. "Arthur!" He looked down the slope. Clara and Henderson were waiting by the truck, which they had moved further down the road. Arthur scrambled down the hillside, his clothes torn and his face blackened with soot, but he was holding the silver bird tight against his chest. When he reached them, Clara threw her arms around him. Henderson sat on the tailgate, breathing in the fresh air with a look of pure gratitude. "You did it, son," the jeweler said. "You broke the pendulum. For now," Arthur said, leaning against the truck. He pulled the silver clock out. It was hot to the touch, and the silver casing was scorched. But the hands were moving again. They were moving forward, at a normal, steady pace. Tick, tock, tick, tock. "We have to get out of here," Clara said, looking at the smoke rising from the mountain. "The noise will bring the state police, and we still don't know who else is part of this." "She's right," Arthur agreed. They piled into the truck. As Arthur turned the key, the radio, which he had left on, crackled to life. It wasn't playing music. It was a high-frequency signal, a series of rhythmic pulses that sounded exactly like the great clock's hum. Arthur reached out to turn the dial, but the signal followed him across the bandwidth. Then, the pulses stopped, replaced by a voice, a deep, calm, and utterly cold voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The Oakhaven regulator was a relic. The voice said. It wasn't talking to the public. It was talking to him. The experiment at Blackwood Ridge was merely a prototype. "Arthur, you have destroyed a gear, but the clock of the world is still winding. You have the bird, but we have the sky." Arthur turned the radio off, but the silence that followed was even more terrifying. He looked at the silver bird. It wasn't just a clock anymore. It was a beacon. They drove back toward Oakhaven in a stunned silence. The sun had set, and the mountain shadows felt like giant hands reaching across the road. Arthur kept his eyes on the rearview mirror, half expecting to see a fleet of black sedans chasing them. But the road remained empty. "Who was that on the radio?" Clara asked, her voice trembling. "The master of the works." Arthur replied, "The one the ledger mentioned. The mayor was just a middleman. Vance was just a thug. The person on that radio, they are the ones who actually own the iron pendulum. They're not going to stop, are they?" Henderson asked. He looked older than he had that morning, the weight of the day's horrors settling into his bones. "No," Arthur said. "They have other sites. Other prototypes. But they need the silver bird to make them work perfectly. That's why we're still alive. They want us to keep it safe until they're ready to take it back." They reached the outskirts of Oakhaven. The town looked peaceful, a picture of small-town perfection with its glowing streetlights and quiet houses. But Arthur now saw the cracks in the picture. He saw the town hall, now dark and empty, and the library, where secrets were buried in the basement. He realized that Oakhaven wasn't just a town, it was a fortress, and he was the sentry. He dropped Henderson off at his shop. The old man insisted on staying, saying his clocks needed him. Arthur and Clara then went to the Sterling house. Thomas Sterling was waiting for them on the porch, a lantern in his hand. "You've seen the face of the enemy," Thomas said as they approached. He didn't ask what happened. He seemed to know. "I saw the machine, Thomas," Arthur said, handing him the scorched silver clock. "And I heard the master. They're everywhere." Thomas Sterling looked at the clock, then at Arthur. "The keepers were never meant to just hide, Arthur. We were meant to be the balance. The iron pendulum wants to accelerate the world until it breaks, so they can own the pieces. We are the ones who keep the rhythm true." He handed the clock back to Arthur. "Keep it. You have proven you can handle the weight of time. But know this, the master of the works is coming for Oakhaven. Not with guns or fire, but with something much more dangerous." "What?" Clara asked. "A new clock," Thomas said, looking at the moon. "One that doesn't need a regulator. They call it the glass heart, and it is already beating somewhere in this town." Arthur looked at his own house across the street. It was small and quiet, but in the silence of the night, he thought he could hear it, a faint, rhythmic thumping, coming not from the silver clock in his hand, but from deep within the earth beneath his own garden. The sound was not in Arthur's head. It was a physical sensation, a low-frequency pulse that vibrated through the soles of his boots and resonated in the marrow of his bones. He stood in the center of his garden, the moonlight casting long, skeletal shadows across the rosebushes he had tended for years. Beside him, Clara held her breath, her hand resting on the trunk of an old apple tree. "It's getting louder," she whispered. "It's not just a thumping anymore. It's a sequence." Arthur knelt on the damp soil. He pressed his ear to the ground. The earth, which usually smelled of life and quiet decay, now carried a faint, metallic scent, like ozone after a lightning strike. The pulse was rhythmic, pause. It was the sound of a heart, but it was too steady, too mechanical to be biological. It was the glass heart that Thomas Sterling had warned them about. "We have to find out how deep it is," Arthur said, his voice tight. He ran to his garden shed and returned with a long steel probe and a shovel. He began to drive the probe into the soft earth near his prized hydrangeas. In most places, the steel sank easily into the loam, but in a perfect circle 3 feet wide, the probe hit something hard and resonant just 2 feet down. "Help me dig," Arthur commanded. They worked in silence, the only sound the scrape of metal on stone and the heavy breathing of 2 people driven by a growing dread. As they cleared the soil, they didn't find the rough granite of a foundation or the rusted iron of a pipe. Instead, they uncovered a surface of smooth, translucent glass. It was curved, like the side of a massive jar, and beneath the glass, a pale, rhythmic light flickered. Arthur cleared more dirt with his hands, revealing a chamber of reinforced glass buried beneath his garden. Inside the glass, suspended in a clear, viscous fluid, was a complex array of silver filaments and golden gears. In the center of the web sat a crystalline core that pulsed with a soft, amber light. Every time it pulsed, the ground beneath them shuddered. "It's beautiful," Clara murmured, reaching out to touch the glass. "Don't," Arthur warned, pulling her back. "Look at the grass around the edges." Clara looked closer. The grass immediately surrounding the glass chamber wasn't just dead, it was frozen in time. A single dewdrop sat on a blade of withered grass, perfectly spherical, refusing to fall or evaporate. A beetle was suspended mid-crawl, its legs locked in a permanent stride. The glass heart wasn't just beating, it was warping the passage of time in a localized field. "It's a parasite," Arthur realized. "It's feeding on the time of the soil, the plants, everything. If it grows, it'll start feeding on the town." As he spoke, the amber light in the core flared bright red. The pulse increased in speed. Far off in the distance, the bells of the Oakhaven church began to ring, but the sound was distorted, slowed down until each peal lasted nearly a minute, a deep, mournful groan that signaled the beginning of the glass heart's reign. By the time the sun rose over Oakhaven, the distortion was no longer a secret. Arthur and Clara walked toward the town square, their hearts heavy. The scene before them was like a painting where the paint was still wet and running. In the town square, the fountain's water didn't splash, it moved in slow, thick ribbons, like transparent honey. Birds were visible in the sky, but they seemed to be swimming through water, their wings flapping in agonizingly slow motion. The people of Oakhaven were the most affected. The baker, Mr. Miller, stood in his doorway, his hand raised to wave, but his arm moved so slowly it looked as if he were underwater. His eyes were wide with a confused, sluggish terror. Those who were further from the center of town seemed normal, but as they walked toward the square, their movements became heavy, their speech slurring into unintelligible growls. "The glass heart is accelerating its intake," Clara said, her own voice sounding strange to her ears. "It's pulling the now out of the air. Arthur, look at your watch." Arthur looked at his wrist. The second hand of his mechanical watch was spinning wildly, making a full rotation every 2 seconds. But when he looked at the silver bird in his hand, the hands were steady, locked in the true time of the keepers. "We need the library," Arthur said. Mrs. Gable said there were records of temporal anomalies from the 1800s. Maybe the first keepers dealt with a glass heart before. They reached the library, which was located on a hill, slightly further from the epicenter of the pulse. Mrs. Gable was there, sitting at her desk, her movements only slightly slowed. She looked at them with desperate eyes. "It's happening again," she managed to say, the words dragging out. Arthur didn't waste time. He ran to the basement archives, Clara right behind him. They searched through the stacks of old, leather-bound journals until they found one with a glass-covered spine. It belonged to Silas Sterling, Thomas's great-grandfather. Inside the journal was a sketch of the very device they had found in Arthur's garden. The chrono vessel. Silas had written, "A gift from the iron pendulum to the town, disguised as a regulator. In truth, it is a siphoning engine. It gathers the lifetime of a population to power the master's great works. To stop it, one must not break the glass, for the release time would shatter the reality of the town. One must provide a counter-resonance." Counter-resonance, Arthur whispered. He looked at the silver bird. "The clock isn't just a key. It's a tuning fork. If I can set the silver bird to the exact opposite frequency of the glass heart, I can neutralize the field. But Silas says it requires a living conduit," Clara noted, pointing to a line of text further down the page. "Someone must hold the regulator against the vessel and withstand the temporal pressure." "Arthur, The last time Silas tried this, he aged 20 years in 20 minutes. Arthur looked at his hands, the hands of a man who had spent his life in the sun and soil. He thought about the frozen beetle in his garden and the terrified eyes of the baker. "I've spent enough time living for myself," he said. "If 20 years is the price for Oakhaven's future, I'll pay it." As Arthur and Clara prepared to leave the library, the front doors opened. A man stepped inside. He was dressed in a sharp, grey suit that seemed to repel the dust of the old building. He wore a silver watch chain across his vest, and his eyes were a pale, piercing blue. He didn't move slowly. In fact, he moved with a fluid, predatory grace that suggested the time distortion didn't affect him at all. "A noble sentiment, Mr. Pendergast," the man said, his voice crisp and perfectly timed. "But I'm afraid the master cannot allow you to interfere with the harvest. The glass heart is at 80% capacity. It would be a shame to waste such a vintage." Arthur stepped in front of Clara, the silver bird gripped tightly in his hand. "Who are you?" "I am Julian Vane," the man said, offering a slight, mocking bow. "The master's horologist. I am the one who planted the seed in your garden. I must say, your soil is remarkably fertile. The time we're extracting from Oakhaven is some of the purest I've ever processed." "You're killing these people," Clara shouted. "They're frozen in their own lives. Death is so permanent," Vane remarked, walking toward them. Arthur noticed that as Vane moved, the air around him seemed to ripple. "They aren't dying. They're simply being preserved. Once the heart is full, we will take it back to the great works, and Oakhaven will return to normal. Of course, they'll find that 50 years have passed in the blink of an eye, but such is the cost of progress." Vane reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, glass sphere. It glowed with the same amber light as the heart in the garden. "Now, Arthur, give me the silver bird. It is an old, inefficient tool. The master wants to retire it. If you want it, come and get it," Arthur said, his voice low and dangerous. Vane smiled, showing teeth that were too white and too perfect. He flicked the glass sphere into the air. As it spun, the time distortion in the library intensified. The bookshelves seemed to stretch, the ceiling rising into infinity. Arthur felt a sudden weight on his chest, as if the air had turned to lead. His movements became sluggish, his vision blurring. Vane moved through the distorted space effortlessly. He reached out a hand for the clock. But Arthur had spent his life working with the seasons, understanding that time isn't just a line, it's a cycle. He closed his eyes, ignoring the visual chaos, and focused on the rhythmic beat of the silver bird in his palm. He used the clock's beat to find his own rhythm. In a sudden burst of speed, Arthur swung the heavy silver bird, striking Vane's outstretched hand. The glass sphere fell and shattered. The distortion snapped back like a broken rubber band. Vane stumbled, a look of genuine shock on his face. You used the anchor," Vane hissed, clutching his bruised hand. "No matter. The heart is almost full. By the time you get back to your garden, there won't be enough now left to save them." With a flick of his wrist, Vane vanished into a shimmer of grey light. The library was silent once more, but outside, the groan of the church bells had grown even deeper. Arthur and Clara ran through the town. It was like running through a nightmare. The sky had turned a strange, bruised purple, and the sun seemed to be stuck in place just above the horizon. They reached Arthur's garden, which was now glowing with a blinding amber light. The hole they had dug was radiating heat, and the glass heart was visible even from the gate, pulsing like a trapped sun. "The air is getting thick," Clara gasped. I can't breathe. It's the time pressure," Arthur said. He could feel his own skin tightening, his hair feeling longer, his joints beginning to ache. The living conduit effect was already starting. He took the silver bird and the gold key. He looked at Clara. Stay outside the circle. If the resonance feedback is too strong, it'll take you to. Arthur, wait. Clara cried. But he was already stepping into the circle of frozen grass. As he entered the field, the world changed. The sound of the wind died away, replaced by a roar like 1,000 ticking clocks. Every second felt like a mountain he had to climb. He reached the edge of the glass chamber. The amber core was now a violent, swirling storm of energy. Arthur knelt by the glass. He could see his reflection in the surface. But the reflection was changing. He saw himself as an old man, then as a child, then as a skeleton. The glass heart was showing him all his possible times at once. Only the truth remains. Arthur whispered, repeating the words from the vault. He pressed the base of the silver bird against the smooth glass. He took the gold key and inserted it into the regulator slot. He didn't turn it to the right or the left. He pushed it straight in, deeper than it had ever gone. The silver bird let out a piercing, silver chime. A shockwave of pure, white energy erupted from the clock, clashing with the amber light of the heart. Arthur screamed as the energy flowed through his arms. He felt his youth being pulled away, his memories flickering like a dying candle. He saw the history of Oakhaven, the founding, the fires, the floods, the laughter of children he had never met. Resonate! Arthur roared. The silver bird's chime grew louder, matching the frequency of the glass heart. For a moment, the two devices were in perfect, deadly harmony. The amber light began to fade, replaced by the cool, steady silver of the clock. The distorted field around the garden began to shrink. But the glass heart was not defeated. It was a product of the master, and it had a final defense. The crystalline core inside the fluid began to fracture. If it shattered, the siphon time would explode, erasing Oakhaven from the map. Arthur realized he couldn't just neutralize it. He had to absorb the excess. Arthur, stop. It's too much. Clara shouted from the gate, her voice finally reaching him through the thinning field. But Arthur didn't stop. He gripped the silver bird with both hands and leaned his forehead against the glass. He opened his mind and his heart, becoming the conduit the machine required. The world became a void of silver and amber. Arthur was no longer in his garden. He was standing in a place of infinite gears and stars. The mind of the master. You are a stubborn flea, Arthur Pendergast. A voice boomed, echoing from the very fabric of the void. It wasn't the voice from the radio. It was deeper, older, a voice that sounded like the grinding of tectonic plates. You would sacrifice your life for a handful of mortals and a few acres of dirt. Why? You could be a master yourself. With that clock, you could walk through the centuries. You could see the beginning and the end. A garden is only beautiful because it dies. Arthur replied, his voice echoing in the void. Time isn't something to be owned. It's something to be shared. You've forgotten what it's like to live in the moment. The moment is a prison. The master roared. The void began to shake. A giant shadow, shaped like a hooded figure with a pendulum for a heart, loomed over Arthur. It reached out a hand made of shattered glass. Give me the regulator, and I will let Oakhaven live. Refuse, and I will turn this town into a cinder of frozen seconds. Arthur looked at the silver bird. It was glowing so brightly now that he could see through his own hands. He realized the master was afraid. The great works needed the Oakhaven frequency because it was the frequency of stability. Without it, the master's empire of stolen time was a house of cards. You can't have it. Arthur said. He didn't fight the shadow. Instead, he did the one thing a gardener knows best. He planted. He pushed the silver bird's energy downward, not into the shadow, but into the ground of the void. He anchored the Oakhaven frequency into the master's own domain. The silver light spread like roots, cracking the void. The shadow let out a scream of mechanical agony. Back in the garden, the glass heart shattered. But there was no explosion. The amber energy, instead of bursting outward, flowed into the silver bird and then into the earth, returning to the people of Oakhaven. Arthur fell back from the glass chamber, the silver bird falling from his nerveless fingers. The amber glow was gone. The sky returned to its natural blue. The church bells rang a single, perfect note. Clara ran to him, falling to her knees. "Arthur! Arthur, speak to me!" Arthur opened his eyes. He felt a deep, profound tiredness. He looked at his hands. They were wrinkled, the skin thin and spotted with age. His hair, once brown, was now a shock of silver white. He had aged 30 years in a single heartbeat. He looked at the silver bird. It was silent, its silver wings tarnished and still. "Is the town okay?" Arthur whispered, his voice raspy and old. Clara looked toward the square. The fountain was splashing. The birds were flying. The baker was waving his hand, the confusion gone from his eyes. "They're safe, Arthur. You saved them." Arthur smiled, a slow, tired smile. He had lost his youth, but he had found his purpose. He was no longer just a gardener. He was a keeper of time, and for the first time in his life, he felt that every second he had left was truly his own. But as he closed his eyes to rest, he heard a faint sound from the broken glass chamber. A small, black gear, identical to the one found in the jewelry shop, was spinning in the dust. The master had lost the heart, but the pendulum was still swinging. Arthur woke the next morning to a world that felt fundamentally heavier. When he tried to sit up, his back protested with a sharp ache he had never known, and his hands, once steady and strong, were mapped with a network of blue veins and wrinkled skin. He walked to the mirror in his hallway and stopped. The man staring back was not the middle-aged gardener of Oakhaven. He was an elder, his hair a striking shock of silver white, his eyes holding a depth of weary wisdom that belonged to someone who had seen decades pass in a single night. "The price of a town's life," Arthur whispered, his voice now a rich, gravelly baritone. A knock at the door saved him from his reflection. It was Thomas Sterling, and for the first time, the two men looked like contemporaries. Thomas didn't offer pity. He offered a nod of profound respect. He carried a small velvet bag and a bottle of dark amber oil. "The resonance took much from you, Arthur," Thomas said, sitting at the kitchen table. "But it gave you something in return. You are now time-sensitive. You can feel the gears of the world in a way I never could. You saved Oakhaven from the glass heart. But the master of the works is no longer content with siphoning. He is moving to the final phase. The Great Reset." Arthur sat down, feeling the stiffness in his knees. "He spoke to me, Thomas. In the void. He thinks the moment is a prison. He wants to own the sequence of all things." Thomas began to polish the silver bird with the amber oil. As he worked, the tarnished metal began to glow with a renewed, fierce light. "The silver bird is the first of three. There is the golden lion in the city of Highgate and the bronze serpent in the coastal town of Oakhaven's sister, Saltmarsh. Together, they are the trinity of the now. The master has already claimed the lion and the serpent. He only needs the bird to complete the Chronos pillar." "And if he completes it?" Arthur asked. "He will rewind the world to a point where the iron pendulum was never a secret, but a god." Thomas explained. "He will erase the last 100 years of history and rewrite it with himself as the architect of time. Everyone we know, everything we've done. It will be as if it never happened." Arthur looked out the window. He saw the baker's children playing in the street. He saw the roses in his garden, beginning to bloom again now that the parasite was gone. He realized that his sacrifice, his lost years, would be for nothing if the master succeeded. He's coming here, isn't he? Arthur asked. He is already here. Thomas replied, looking toward the town square. The grey mist is beginning to rise. He isn't sending Vance or Vane this time. He is bringing the tower to the bird. By nightfall, Oakhaven was no longer a town. It was an island in a sea of grey. A thick, unnatural mist had rolled in from the mountains, swallowing the roads and silencing the woods. It wasn't a mist of water, but of UN time, a static field that numbed the senses and made the mind wander into half-forgotten dreams. Arthur stood on his porch, the silver bird hanging from a leather cord around his neck. Clara and Mr. Henderson were with him, along with a dozen townspeople who had refused to hide. They carried lanterns filled with special oil Thomas had provided, fueled by the distilled seconds collected over generations. The light from the lanterns cut through the grey mist, creating small bubbles of reality in the encroaching void. They're coming from the fog, Henderson whispered, clutching a heavy iron wrench. Shapes began to emerge from the grey. They were the grey men, the Master's elite agents. They didn't walk so much as they glided, their movements perfectly synchronized. They wore masks of polished brass that had no eyes, only a single vertical slit in the center. In their hands, they carried rods of glass that hummed with the same amber light as the glass heart. Don't let them touch you, Arthur warned. Those rods will drain your now on contact. The grey men didn't speak. They moved in a phalanx toward the center of the garden. Arthur stepped forward, his silver hair catching the lantern light. He felt the silver bird pulse against his chest. It was a warning. You want the bird? Arthur shouted, his voice echoing in the dead air. Come and take it from a man who has nothing left to lose. The first wave of grey men lunged. They were fast, but to Arthur's time-sensitive eyes, they were moving in a predictable rhythm. He could see the hiccups in their motion, the tiny fractions of a second where they were vulnerable. He moved with a grace that defied his aged body, using the silver bird to parry the glass rods. Each time the clock struck a grey man's weapon, a shower of silver sparks erupted, and the agent dissolved into a puddle of grey sand. But for every agent Arthur defeated, 3 more emerged from the mist. The townspeople fought bravely, their lanterns held high, but the grey field was growing stronger. Arthur, look! Clara cried, pointing toward the town square. In the center of Oakhaven, where the fountain had been, a massive structure was rising from the earth. It was a tower of black iron and shimmering glass, thousands of gears turning on its exterior like the skin of a living creature. The Kronos pillar was manifesting. At its peak, a great pendulum began to swing, and with every stroke, the grey mist pushed further into the town, turning the houses into ghostly, translucent shells. The Master wasn't just attacking, he was replacing Oakhaven with a memory of itself. We have to get to the pillar, Arthur yelled over the rising roar of the machine. He, Clara, and Thomas ran toward the square, the silver bird acting as a shield against the temporal winds. The closer they got to the tower, the more the world began to fracture. They saw visions of Oakhaven's past, horse-drawn carriages overlapping with modern cars, the Great Fire of 1920 burning alongside the winter snow of 1998. It was a kaleidoscope of a century, all being pulled into the black iron maw of the tower. The bird is the only thing that can stabilize the center, Thomas shouted. Arthur, you have to climb to the apex. You have to place the bird in the master gear. What about the master? Clara asked. He will be at the heart of the mechanism, Thomas said. He has become the clock himself. The base of the tower was guarded by Julian Vane. He looked different now. His skin was a dull metallic grey, and his eyes were glowing amber. He held a long sword made of shattered glass. The master is waiting, Arthur, Vane hissed. He wants to thank you for bringing the final piece. Out of my way, Vane, Arthur said. He didn't use a weapon. He reached out and touched the silver bird. He didn't try to fight Vane's time. He invited it. He allowed the bird to absorb the distortion Vane was radiating. Vane let out a scream as the amber energy was sucked out of him and into the silver clock. He aged centuries in seconds, turning into dust that was instantly scattered by the wind. Arthur didn't wait. He began to climb the exterior of the tower. The gears were hot, the smell of grease and lightning filling his lungs. Clara followed him, helping him over the moving shafts. As they climbed, they saw the town below them fading away, becoming a grey smudge on the horizon. They reached the top platform. In the center of a swirling vortex of golden light stood a man. He wasn't the giant shadow Arthur had seen in the void. He was an old man, perhaps even older than Arthur, wearing a simple clockmaker's apron. He was sitting at a workbench, meticulously filing a small brass gear. This was the master of the works. "You're late, Arthur," the master said, without looking up. "But I suppose time is a relative concept for someone in your condition." He turned around. His face was a map of 1,000 years of grief. "Do you know why I built this, Arthur? Not for power. Not for gold. I built it because I lost my daughter to a single, stray second. A car that didn't stop, a breath that didn't come. I decided then that no one should ever have to lose anything to the randomness of time again. I will fix the world. I will make every second perfect." Arthur looked at the master, and for the first time, he didn't feel fear. He felt a profound, aching pity. "You're not fixing the world, Alistair," Arthur said, using the name he had seen in the master's private ledger. "You're taxidermying it. You're killing the soul of life to save the body. Life is pain," Alistair roared, standing up. He held a staff that contained the golden lion and the bronze serpent. The two regulators were glowing with a violent, trapped energy. "I will bring her back. I will bring everyone back. We will live in the perfect noon of 1912 forever." "And what happens to the children born today?" Clara asked, stepping onto the platform. "What happens to the new stories, the new loves? They don't exist in your 1912. Alistair hesitated for a fraction of a second. "They are a small price for the end of suffering." He raised his staff, and a bolt of amber lightning struck the platform. Arthur ducked, the silver bird humming a low, defensive note. The duel was not one of swords, but of rhythms. Alistair pulsed with the heavy time of the pendulum, trying to crush Arthur under the weight of 1,000 years. Arthur responded with the light time of the bird, the frequency of the present moment. The platform shook as the two forces clashed. The black iron of the tower began to glow red-hot. "You can't win, Arthur," Alistair cried, his eyes weeping amber light. "I have the lion and the serpent. I have the weight of the ages. But you don't have the bird," Arthur said, standing tall. He felt his age-worn body vibrating with a strange, new energy. "The bird isn't about the past or the future. It's about the now. And the now is the only thing that is truly real." Arthur realized what he had to do. He didn't need to defeat Alistair. He needed to complete the circuit. He ran toward the master gear, the giant, central hub that connected the three regulators. Alistair tried to stop him, but Clara threw her lantern at the master's feet. The distilled seconds ignited, creating a barrier of pure, bright time that Alistair couldn't cross. Arthur reached the master gear. He saw the empty slot in the center. He looked at the silver bird one last time. He knew that if he placed it there, the energy would be too much for him to survive. He would be the final conduit. "Arthur, no!" Clara screamed. Arthur turned and gave her a smile, not the tired smile of an old man, but the bright, hopeful smile of the gardener she had first met. "Tell Thomas, the roses are going to be beautiful this year." Arthur shoved the silver bird into the center of the master gear and turned the gold key one final time. The explosion was not of fire, but of light, a white, blinding brilliance that washed over Oakhaven, the mountains, and the sky. It wasn't a sound, but a feeling of a giant not being untied. The Chronos pillar didn't collapse. It simply dissolved, the stolen seconds flowing back to where they belonged. The grey men vanished, the mist evaporated, and the visions of the past settled back into the history books. When the light faded, the town square was empty. The tower was gone. The fountain was splashing again, its water clear and cool. Clara stood in the center of the square, blinking in the morning sun. Beside her stood Thomas Sterling and Mr. Henderson. They were all back in their own time. The world was right again. "Arthur!" Clara called out, her voice trembling. She found him sitting on a bench near the fountain. He was still the silver-haired man he had become, but the weary look was gone. He looked peaceful, his face resting in the warmth of the sun. In his lap sat the silver bird. It was no longer glowing. It was just a beautiful old clock, its silver wings tarnished but whole. The master was gone. Alistair had been returned to his own time, a man who had to finally face the grief he had tried to outrun. The iron pendulum was broken, its gears scattered to the winds of history. Arthur looked up as Clara approached. He reached out a hand, and she took it. His skin was still wrinkled, but his grip was firm. "You're still, you," she whispered, her eyes filling with tears. "I am," Arthur said. "I stayed old. I think the world needs at least one person who remembers the cost of a second." Thomas Sterling walked over and placed a hand on Arthur's shoulder. "The Keepers are no longer a secret society, Arthur. We are just people who look after the day. You've done more than any of us." Arthur stood up, his joints still aching slightly, but he felt a vitality he couldn't explain. He looked at his house across the street. The garden was in full bloom. The roses were a deep, vibrant red, their petals holding the morning dew. "What do we do now?" Clara asked, looking at the silver bird. Arthur smiled and tucked the clock into his coat pocket. "I think," he said, "I'm going to go home and finish my gardening. There's a lot of work to do, and I've got all the time in the world." The bells of the Oakhaven church rang then. Not a groan, not a warning, but a simple, honest announcement of 10 o'clock. Life went on. The seconds ticked forward, precious and fleeting, and for the first time in a century, the town of Oakhaven was exactly where it was meant to be, right here, right now.